Chapter 862. For a son of man, this was a very difficult question, but Li Feng's answer was not difficult at all. He looked at the few wisps of smoke in the depths of the tombs and replied with an expressionless face, "I don't know." 3 years ago, when he rushed back to the capital ring from the front lines, he kicked open the door to Li Jiedu's office and roared in anger to the point of madness, but in the end, he could not take out the gun at his waist and shoot his biological father behind the desk into a beehive. In the countless nights after that, the young Federation colonel had thought about this situation that made him feel cold and sad many times, but he could not find any conclusion. After Du Shaoqing heard his answer, after a moment of silence, he slowly took off the black lambskin glove and held it in his hand. He pointed at the mountains behind the tombs and changed the topic. "That princess is definitely waiting for me to leave. Although I am not arrogant, I must admit that the imperial people will definitely think that my departure is their opportunity." He looked at Li Feng and slowly said, "But although I am leaving, you must deliver the gift I left for that princess. In the Battle of the Straits, if we can tear off the fattest piece of meat on the imperial armies, Mo Hua planet can at least maintain the balance for half a year, and by that time, I should probably be back." Li Feng thought of the top-secret military deployment plan that had been passed around in the command center last night, and the way he looked back at Du Shaoqing had some subtle changes. If that deployment was really successful, the Imperial Army that intended to take advantage of the situation to launch a large-scale counterattack would suffer a heavy blow at the Straits. After a slight pause, he used ordinary words to give the most powerful promise. "Commander, I will definitely deliver the surprise you gave to Huai Chaoshi personally. Although I will be bringing the 7th Division back this time, it will not affect the balance of power between the two sides. I even wanted to bring the 17th Division back, but I was stopped." Du Shaoqing's eyebrows suddenly furrowed, and a rare trace of irritation appeared in his indifferent eyes. He said coldly, "Commander Yu is officially retired. I am a bit worried about leaving your grandfather's Iron Division on Mo Hua planet. He came from the 3rd Military Region, and the undefeated Iron 7th Division and the 17th Armored Division that carried the glory of the God of War were the two peaks of the federal military that could not coexist," but Li Feng did not doubt the truth of the other's words. The so-called bearing, vision, and breadth of mind decided how far a person could go on the road of life. Du Shaoqing was already the Federation's frontline commander, and in his eyes, every federal forces, every Federation soldier was an important point that he had to pay attention to, let alone an important unit like the 17th Division. However, as a famous general, Du Shaoqing was actually worried that the frontline troops would be harmed by some invisible force. It was really hard to imagine. Only Li Feng, who was on the front line and knew the Federation's political situation and the changes in the upper echelons, understood why he was worried. Because of the explosion of the antique bell, the terrorist attack on Parliament Hill, and Su Li's defection, the Federation's capital ring had a strange political atmosphere in the past few years. The Federation government led by President Pabre seized more power through elections and street campaigns. In the face of the counterattacks launched by the big families and the rumors circulating in society, the government began to use tough means and formed a joint unit made up of the Bureau of Proclamation, the Federation Investigation Bureau, and a Special Operations Department. After an unprecedentedly fierce debate on Parliament Hill, the joint unit obtained a very rare high-level authority and began to silently wander among the various departments of the government, investigating the spies that the big families had planted in the government and cleaning up the employees who disobeyed the government's orders. At the same time, the Federation government asked the people to make sacrifices for this costly space war and the internal strife in society. They vigorously promoted the spirit of self-discipline and dedication and tried to use powerful media to suppress most of the opposing opinions, making the entire Federation a powerful fist. However, both Mr. President and Li Jiedu seemed to have forgotten that once they began to protect the government's authority through secret investigations, the government would always rely on the deterrence brought by the secret investigations. Once they began to suppress opposing opinions through the media, the government would always rely on the surface peace brought by the suppression of news. Once they began to use the extremely impactful crimes of sabotaging the war and attempting to betray the country to protect their rule, they would have to face the reality that these crimes were becoming more and more boring by the day. They could only come up with new and more explosive words. A political scholar from the capital university had already named the changes in the Federation politics in the past 3 years as the Pobre Doctrine. He commented with undisguised mockery that if creating a panic atmosphere was the only way to keep the Federation government going, then it would be better to invite the Emperor of Empire to be the president. It should be known that the Emperor of Empire was definitely better at this than Mr. Pobre. Afterward, this political scholar was invited by the Joint Investigation Department, which had extremely high authority, to investigate. Although the Joint Investigation Department released the scholar 10 days later under pressure from many parties, at the hearing, the government presented evidence that the scholar had received funding from the Xiao Shu Foundation. The next day, the Federation Academic Committee criticized the scholar in the name of improper acceptance of academic donations and involvement in academic corruption. Although the capital university did not fire the scholar, they still persuaded him to resign from his position as the dean of the department. Su Lu was exposed as a citizen of empire. The two people that President Pobre admired the most were only left with Du Shaoqing, and he did not disappoint the president and many people. Whether it was when he was the commander of the Iron 7th Division or when he later commanded all the federal forces on the front line, every victory that Du Shaoqing had in the Zhuotian galaxy increased President Pobre's public support by a few percentage points. The endless news of victories on the front line also successfully diluted the current dark color of the Federation politics. Because the former Commander-in-Chief Du Shaoqing was deeply trusted by the Federation, the Secret Investigation Department that echoed like a cold wind among the Federation's administrative districts was temporarily unable to extend its tentacles into the military. At least, it did not have the power to have any influence on the situation on the front line. However, something happened 2 months ago. Zhou Yu, who was now the commander of the 2nd Regiment of the Iron 7th Division, was ordered to return to the capital Star Ring to enlist resources. When he was about to embark on his return journey, he was forcibly taken away by the Secret Investigation Department at the military base. They accused him of receiving secret funding from the Xiao Shu Foundation while he was studying at the 1st Military Academy. He had to undergo strict investigation to prevent the evil family forces from infiltrating the pure and solemn federal forces. Did the 7 families infiltrate the federal military? Of course, except for the Zhong family in the West Woods. The Li family had always wanted to marry the Lis of Philadelphia. Li Xiaotong still maintained his status as an active military officer. The Nan family had always been inextricably linked with the military logistics system. As for the only heir of the Macho family, he had once fought in the front line. However, when the old man by the Lake of Philadelphia was alive, these families could not have any influence on the federal forces. Now that the old man had passed away, how could President Pobre and Li Jiedu allow this to happen? Chapter 863. No one knew why the Federation government's Secret Investigation Department suddenly made a move against the military. After analysis, it was probably because the head of the department was blinded by the continuous victories in the liquidation campaign, or because they were blinded by the warm praise from the president's residence, or because those officials were not blinded at all. They just trusted General Du Shaoqing's loyalty to the president too much. In addition, in their opinion, Zhou Yu, who was born in the West Woods and had endless connections with Su Lu, could not be considered a direct descendant of the Iron 7th Division. Therefore, they decided to use the gentle and excellent military officer as a kind of announcement to intimidate the Regency Council. However, the response from the front line made the Secret Investigation Department realize that they had made a serious error in their judgment. They had no choice but to swallow the consequences of their actions. Du Shaoqing, who had always only cared about war and not politics, immediately dialed the interstellar encrypted delayed number when he received the news that Zhou Yu had been arrested. On the phone, he used a cold and gloomy voice to express his contempt and anger without hiding his feelings. He directly cursed the director of the president's residence, Mr. Breen, into a pile of stinky dog shit. Then, without waiting for the other party to make any explanation, he extremely rudely hung up the phone. Today, Director Breen was the chief butler of the president's residence and deeply trusted by President Pobre. No matter where he went in the Federation, he was a respected figure. However, after being cursed by the cold voice of the general on the other end of the phone, he did not dare to show any angry reaction. This was because the person who cursed and looked down on him was called Du Shaoqing. Although he was in the distant Wutian sector, he was deeply trusted by the president and respected by the people. He had millions of soldiers in his hands, and his heart was as hard as iron. Director Breen put down the phone and walked into the Oval Office with a livid expression. The president furrowed his brows. General Li Jiedu raised his eyebrows and did not say anything. Breen, however, understood something. He quickly drove to the Secret Investigation Department with the small blood-red eye pattern painted on it and cursed everyone into a pile of stinky dog shit. Then, he personally entered the prison. After repeatedly apologizing, he picked up Zhou Yu, who had not yet been interrogated, and immediately sent him back to the front line on a battleship. Countless light years away, when the general was angry, the officials trembled. This was probably the scene. "I'm leaving now. Lieutenant General who will temporarily take over the position of commander. You know that person has no ability other than singing the praises of Mr. President and arranging trusted aides for your father. At that time, who could stop Small Eyes Department from infiltrating the front line? After all, they have higher authority than us." Du Shaoqing looked at the setting sun that was setting over the mountains with an expressionless face. He said calmly, "For my sake, the other troops, even the dozen or so divisions in the West Woods, shouldn't be harassed too much. But the new 17th Division might not be so safe. After all, that division carries the glorious history of the Federation, but in recent years, it has taken on too much of Su Li's scent. The Federation hates this scent. So those people want to use cleaning to get rid of this smell." Li Feng raised his sword-like eyebrows. He couldn't help but speak with a hint of ruthlessness. He said coldly, "No one knows where Su Lu is. After knowing that he's from the Empire, whether it's the 17th Division or the members of Group 7 back then, they all performed extremely well on the battlefield. Why is the Federation still unwilling to let go?" Du Shaoqing didn't explain. In fact, both of them knew very well why this situation had happened. Although Su Lu was forced to flee the Federation, the way he fled was too open and arrogant. The Federation government, from the president to the officials of the various departments, all held a grudge in their hearts. "No one is suitable to watch over this matter. Only you are the most suitable," the general said calmly. Li Feng lowered his gaze slightly. Looking at the slightly charred black soil in front of his military boots, a trace of self-mockery appeared on his face that was no longer young and inexperienced. He was indeed the most suitable person because his biological father had always been secretly controlling that secret investigation team. No matter how arrogant, cold-blooded, shameless, and despicable that department was, they wouldn't dare disrespect him in the slightest. The capital ring is very chaotic right now. Although I don't understand why you're willing to go back, before we leave, I want to remind the commander of something. Li Feng looked at Du Shaoqing and said, "No matter how glorious, right, and great the president is in your heart, no matter whether he's the source of your ideals for fighting bloody battles all these years, please remember that soldiers like us who only know how to fight are best not involved in the political affairs of the Federation." "As a soldier, I must obey the president's orders," Du Shaoqing replied. Li Feng sighed and shook his head, saying, "Commander Shaoqing, I really don't want you to become someone like my father. Du Shaoqing was silent for a very long time as he faced the foreign dusk. Then, he smiled with a complicated expression and said calmly, I'm not Li Jiedu, nor am I Zhong Suohu. Speaking of which, I suddenly thought of something. If you have the opportunity to meet Su Lo on the Mo Hua planet in the future, please help me ask if that little girl from the Zhong family is doing well. The little girl from the Zhong family had now grown into a beautiful young lady. She held on to Su Li's hand and stood up slowly in front of the grave. After the man beside her calmed down slightly, she smiled and said, speaking of which, Tianjing planet is the safest place for Big Brother Su Lo. Even if you killed 2 of their princes, who would dare to do anything to you? We really should have come a long time ago. Although this should be my hometown in name, to be honest, I don't have the slightest sense of belonging to this planet and this palace. Zhong Huiyan shrugged cutely and asked curiously, then where are we going after this? Mo Hua planet or Bermuda? Why aren't you willing to go back to the Federation to take a look? Even if the charter has been waiting for you, with the abilities of that transvestite, Philip, your safety is guaranteed. I'm not going back to the Federation because there's a question that I can't find an answer to. Su Lo looked at the young lady and said, I've already lost the right to choose a side. If I can't find a way to resolve the conflict between the 2 sides, then there's no meaning in going back or appearing. At this moment, his thick black eyebrows furrowed. He seriously listened to the warning signal in his ears. Without hesitation, he held on to Zhong Huiyan's hand, turned around, and walked with his back facing the grave. Far away from the willow embankment, countless fully armed elite soldiers of the Imperium appeared like dark clouds. Then, clear music echoed leisurely. Dozens of maids of the Imperium holding golden sunflower ceremonial fans slowly walked over, dragging their flowing dresses behind them. Behind them was an enormous carriage painted with the pattern of black hibiscus. The middle-aged man on the carriage had a dignified appearance, calm and graceful. He was the Empire's emperor, Huai Fuchai. Chapter 864. Su Lo had never thought that he would be able to hide his tracks after entering the left sky star sector and landing on Tianjing planet. However, he was still shocked by the arrival of the ceremonial guards at the end of the willow embankment. He realized that he had underestimated the power of the royal family that ruled the left sky star sector. They had discovered him much earlier than he had expected. The chief steward of the royal palace, who was wearing a brown uniform, walked up to the 2 of them. His sharp voice was extremely gentle, but he did not speak to Su Lo. Instead, he bowed humbly and said gently, Your Highness, the peach blossoms of the 3-headed centipede are blooming. Would you like to take a look? Zhong Huiyan understood that the chief steward was clearing the area for the emperor. Although she was curious about what would happen after Brother Su Lo met her biological father, she knew that some conversations could only happen between the father and son. Therefore, she looked up at Su Lo. After receiving the look of inquiry, Su Lo thought for a while and asked, Is the place where the peach blossoms are blooming far away? The chief steward replied softly, Not far away. This place was close to the Empire's royal palace, so there should be no problem in terms of safety. Therefore, Su Lo nodded. After the arrival of the ceremonial guards, the young nobles of the Empire who were admiring the flowers and beauties, as well as the old and sickly people who were kowtowing in front of the palace walls, all of them disappeared in an instant. There were faint figures of guards in the distance. However, at the end of the willow embankment, there was only a shallow grave and 2 men. A wind blew in from the south, causing the leaves to sway uneasily. An indifferent voice sounded, carrying an indescribable sense of majesty as it easily passed through the shade of the trees. Su Lo did not hear what the other party was saying. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the man in the black and gold hibiscus imperial robe very seriously and rudely. There was no expression on his face, but the shallow lake in his heart had already started to ripple. He thought to himself in a daze. If it was in the past, and he could get so close to the emperor of the empire, he would definitely kill him at all costs, even if it would cost him his life. However, he was no longer a member of the Federation, nor was he a soldier of the Federation. The man with the greatest power in the universe in front of him had become his father. This was truly an absurd and incomprehensible world. Su Lu recalled that he was captured by Huai Chao Shi and brought to the Empire. When he entered the stargazing pavilion in the Imperial Palace, he saw the Emperor for the first time. He saw the Emperor's brother, Prince Bai Wu, the head of the Imperial military headquarters, jump into the clouds because of a rebellion. Then, he was beaten into a bloody figure by the Emperor with metal hooks. Not a single part of his body was left unscathed. At that time, every time the thorns fell, it brought pain and humiliation. What did he curse in anger? Fuck your mother. Yes, it was like that at the time. Su Lu, who was standing under the willow tree and looking silently at the lonely grave, could not help but curl his lips. He was probably the only person in the world who had the opportunity to say those 3 words to Huai Fuchai. However, the smile on his lips quickly disappeared and turned into a very strong self-mockery. Although it was satisfying to say such words, it was really meaningless. He remembered that he seemed to have said the same words to Macklin and Keaton. Did it mean that he had been trying to fuck his grandmother, his great-aunt, and all the female elders? Well, it was still an absurd and incomprehensible past. Because of this inexplicable dark emotion, Su Lu woke up from this strange mental state. Only then did the cold and majestic voice forced out of the black and gold hibiscus imperial robe enter his ears effectively for the first time. You are a stupid person. You can't even be called a man, and you are far inferior to your sister. Huai Fuchai looked at him and said in a low voice, as a man, you should understand where your responsibility lies, and not escape because of those illusory moral pleasures. Huai Fuchai put his hands behind his back and looked leisurely at Peach Mountain. He said coldly and mockingly, there is no such thing as true fairness in this world. If you still insist on this, then you are not even as good as the children in Chaimen kindergarten. The Huai family of White Hibiscus took advantage of the situation in the past and took the hegemony of the left sky galaxy. It has been hundreds of years since then, and it is all because the Creator chose us, the most excellent bloodline among all living things. And for the sake of this brilliant galaxy, the royal family has sacrificed too much. Especially in these 70 years, for the sake of this cruel universe war, for the sake of protecting this peaceful galaxy, who knows how many young people have died in battle between the stars. Huai Fuchai slowly turned around and stared coldly into Su Li's eyes. There are even more members of the royal family like you, drifting alone to the other end of the universe. Most of them, if they did not die in the space channel, they died in the cold huts of Bermuda. Those who were lucky enough to survive, in the end, inevitably died in the purges of the Federation's Bureau of Proclamation. I have 37 sons, and now you are the only one alive. You have the obligation to live well in place of your 36 dead brothers, and bravely bear the responsibility you should bear. This is the glory of your bloodline that the heavens have bestowed upon you, and you cannot refuse. I have been to White Hibiscus, I have been to the ancestral shrine of the Huai family. After a long silence, Su Lu raised his head and calmly looked back into the unfathomable eyes of the monarch. In my view, it was not the Creator who chose the Huai family as the royal family, but the ancestor of the Hua family, that woman who crossed the galaxy from the ancestral star, chose the ancestor of the Huai family. To put it more harshly, the so-called glory of the royal family is nothing more than a few hundred years of living off a woman. Huai Fuchai's brows slowly rose. His anger did not appear, but one could see that his weathered brows were like swords. Without waiting for him to become angry, Su Lu continued, as for how many people of the royal family died in this war, it has nothing to do with the royal family enjoying the privilege of tens of billions of slaves. There is no need to debate whether the royal family is fighting for the people of the Left Sky Galaxy or for their own rule. At least I know one thing very clearly, under your tacit approval and even secret urging, Keaton's butcher's knife swept through several galaxies. Of the tens of millions of people who died, who knows how many families were lost? Compared to those heads in pools of blood, the sacrifice of the royal family really does not have much reason to be praised. Back then, in Huai Fuchai's eyes, Su Lu was the bastard son of that damned dog thief Nasri. He was a dog-shit war hero that the Federation deliberately promoted. He was an insignificant figure that could die at any time, so he vented his anger with thorns and could not be bothered to look him in the eye. The stars moved and the situation changed. Huai Fuchai suddenly discovered that this young man was actually the only bloodline he had left in the universe. Naturally, his feelings were very different, but he did not expect that today, outside the palace walls, he would hear an ear-piercing lecture. The Emperor's eyes slowly narrowed as he coldly assessed Su Lu. He increasingly felt that it was very reasonable that he had never liked this kid. Everything that needs to be done is almost done. Starting to update normally, tomorrow at 3 o'clock. Chapter 865. Huai Fuchai flicked his sleeves. An emperor's sleeve could disperse the stars, but in front of Lu Dai's tomb, it couldn't disperse even a wisp of cloud. Su Lu was like a stone, seemingly oblivious to his anger, oblivious to his resentment and loathing, as if a storm was brewing in his sleeve. He only looked at him quietly, his extraordinarily thick black eyebrows not even trembling in the slightest. After the wind from the south blew at the willow branches a dozen times, Huai Fuchai finally suppressed the anger in his chest. His eyes narrowed slightly, like a lion staring at a small ball of meat playing in the red wasteland. He continued to use a cold tone to continue his harsh commentary. For a world as vast as the Left Sky Galaxy, how can it continue to develop steadily? From the nobles to the people of the Empire, no one is willing to be like those plastic-eating trash in the Federation, wearing a dog chain behind their heads. Then what should we do? Huai Fuchai stared into Su Li's eyes, his hands slowly loosening in his sleeves. It was obvious that there was a trace of disdain and tiredness in his eyes. He slowly raised his right arm and pointed behind the black and green palace walls, at the stargazing tower that towered into the clouds, taller and more majestic than the space-based tower. It is impossible to rely on Tianjing or this palace to rule the Left Sky Galaxy. We must use strong methods to maintain the integrity of the Empire. Although you have always been in the army and are unbearably stupid, since you have read so many history books of the Empire these past few years, you should have this kind of common knowledge. The relationship between the time when information is transmitted and effective rule. Su Lu nodded and replied, I can roughly understand what you mean, but these past few years of reading the Empire's history books, I have been thinking about this question. If we must use such bloody methods to maintain the strict hierarchy, then only then can we ensure the integrity of the Empire. His brows furrowed slightly, and he raised his head to meet the Emperor's scrutinizing gaze. He asked doubtfully, then why do we have to maintain the integrity of the Empire? If there is no the glory of the Charter of the Universe, it is no longer suitable for the existence of such a large empire. Why can't the royal family go with the flow? Huai Fuchai's eyes narrowed slightly, and he pointed at his face, trembling with anger as he scolded, Fool! Stupid! Don't you have any respect for the bloodline in your body and the history of this star area? Even if you don't have the slightest respect and dare to have such a rebellious and irredeemable thought, don't you understand how many conflicts of interest and how many flames of war will be ignited in the universe after the Imperium collapses and the galaxies become independent? Ever since he had taken the risk to cross the spatial passage and head to Bermuda to instigate Macklyn's rebellion, as the Emperor of the Empire, Wifchai had rarely spoken so much to someone. He was the high and mighty king of the Left Sky Galaxy, the most mysterious person in power in the universe. He hid in the depths of the palace, on the top of the tall buildings, and a casual order from him could make tens of thousands of heads fall to the ground. When he saw the face of the girl behind the sunflower screen, that made him feel humiliated. The Imperial Expeditionary Force that had been guarding the West Woods for decades would be wiped out in order to wash away the king's humiliation. Today, under the shade of the willows outside the palace walls, Wai Fuchai had suppressed his emotions and spoken for so long with Su Lu. He had even made his words so obvious, almost like a kind and patient teacher. It had to be said that he had placed a great deal of hope on this son who had wandered the Federation for so many years and was still alive. However, Su Li's answer was still so personal. He looked at Wai Fuchai and said simply and directly, "In regards to these things, I really don't understand much. As the successor of the empire, you must understand these things, or else you will make an unforgivable mistake." Wai Fuchai looked coldly at his son and said, "With your intelligence, it is impossible that you really don't understand these things. Or is it that you are simply not willing to understand these things, so that you can simplify your life and your judgments of value so that it is easier to satisfy your vanity? You should know very well that the matters of the universe will always be so complicated. It is not a basic problem that can be solved by carrying a few guns and killing a few people. Regardless of whether it is Prince Doring's death or your desire to avenge Zhong Shouhu, they are in fact all childish and useless work. Everything you do must be based on the results, to see what kind of goal you can achieve. But do you really understand what your goal is? What is the purpose of your life?" Hearing these words, Su Lu sank into a long period of silence. It was not because of the title of successor of the empire, but because he realized that the man who could become the master of the Left Sky Star region was indeed not simple. These very simple arguments were deeply chiseled into the depths of his heart, pointed in every direction, precise and fatal, so that he did not know how to refute. "He's letting you go just like that. What else? He can't let you go so easily, right? What else? Since he doesn't want to kill me, what else can he do but let me go? Speaking of which, although I don't want to admit that I am the only living son of this emperor, this identity does seem to be very useful." After walking past the willow embankment and circling around a few flowers and trees, they arrived at the famous Xiaoming Lake Park on Tianjing Planet. This park was open to all citizens, so it was much more lively than the palace. Zhong Huiyan held Su Li's hand and struggled to move forward in the crowd. After ending that unpleasant conversation, Su Li's mood was a little strange. He kept walking in silence. The girl beside him had already grown up, but she still could not keep up with his speed. From time to time, they would have to stagger their steps to maintain a harmonious rhythm. "If I were the emperor, I could put you under house arrest in the depths of the palace, then mobilize countless noble beauties, sacrificed military officers, orphans, and white-haired historians to brainwash you. After doing this for a few decades, maybe you would really submit." Zhong Huiyan raised her face and looked at Su Li's clear jawline. She giggled. "A few decades. That guy might have died long ago." Su Li didn't even look back as she walked away, her footsteps crisp and clear. Zhong Huiyan's eyes widened. She bit her lower lip and said in shock, "That's your father. I'm still your brother, but you still want to send me to the depths of the palace without anyone knowing. Actually, what's wrong with being the emperor of the empire? It's much better than being the president of the Federation. The most powerful man in the universe can do whatever he wants. When the time comes, he can lead the troops to attack S1, strip Pabre and lead Jadu naked, tie them up, and parade them through the streets together." The girl excitedly imagined the scene that could happen. Su Lu suddenly stopped in his tracks. He stood in the noisy crowd that swam around like fish, laughed at himself, and then said something. At this moment, the turntable amusement vehicle on the east side of the park started to move. The loud sound of the engine starting covered his voice. "What did you say?" Zhong Huiyan asked loudly. Su Lu turned his head and looked at the girl's young face. He replied loudly, only an idiot would be the emperor. At this moment again, the word, coincidentally, was suitable for this moment. The turntable amusement vehicle started, and the humming sound of the huge engine stopped abruptly. Xiaoming Lake Park had a very short moment of silence. As a result, the words, only an idiot would be the emperor, seemed to be magnified many times. They reverberated above the heads of the people of the empire and did not fall to the ground for a long time. Countless pairs of complicated eyes stared at the young man and woman. There was shock, curiosity, doubt, disbelief, and even anger. There was a deep hatred like the death of an old family member. Before he was caught by the people and handed over to the Public Security Bureau or torn into pieces on the charge of treason, Su Lu held Zhong Huiyan's slightly cold hand tightly and broke through the crowd like a gust of wind, disappearing into the distant streets. The narrow streets were full of dirty water and smelly mud. Yellow Cabbage Leaf stubbornly straightened her back in the mud. She wanted to express her anger and disappointment that she was not picked up by the scavengers, but she was immediately stepped in by all kinds of feet. Her mouth was full of smelly mud, and it was difficult to express the hidden resentment in her heart. The houses on the street were dilapidated. The wooden doors that looked like cultural relics that were close to the state of decay were still considerately covering the owner's privacy. However, most of the bottom of the door panel had been eroded by dirty water and rats' teeth, allowing the thin cats and lazy dogs to freely enter and leave. The market under the big locust tree in front of them released the smell of all kinds of life. Life was originally complicated, and the lives of different classes of human beings were different. The aristocrats who had automatic flushing toilets probably had not even smelled their own feces, but the smell of this market fully demonstrated the complex smell of the poor people at the bottom of the hierarchy. The smell of stinky sauce mixed with the smell of urine flowing out of the public toilet was really not a good smell. Zhong Huiyan frowned and used her sleeve to cover her nose. She looked at the scenery of the slums in puzzlement. She did not know why Su Lu had brought her here. Although she had followed Su Lu to many places in the past few years and had come into contact with the lives of the people at the bottom of society under the strict principles of education, she still found it hard to imagine that in the capital of the empire, less than 10 kilometers away from the imperial palace, there was actually such a poor and backward street. Su Lu, who had put on his hat again, did not explain. He just held her hand and walked. They bought a bag of crudely made parts from a hardware store by the roadside. They walked past a white courtyard and turned into a secluded alley. Looking at the time, the stall should be closed by now. Looking at the familiar dilapidated courtyard in the alley, Su Lu muttered to himself. His right hand that was holding the bag tightened subconsciously. Zhong Huiyan looked at him curiously. She was surprised by her brother's nervousness at this moment. Even when he met the empire's emperor, he was not as nervous as he was now. Could the courtyard at the end of the alley be even more terrifying than the netherworld? The sound of tut, 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 tut rang out, accompanied by rough curses. A strong, or rather, obese woman rode a small three-wheeled electric scooter to the entrance of the small courtyard. Twisting her thick, bucket-like waist, she took out a bunch of keys and walked up the stairs while cursing. Su Lu looked at that figure, and a surge of warmth suddenly surged in his chest and abdomen. He quickly walked up to that small courtyard that used to be paradise. Chapter 866. The most unusual thing about this small courtyard in the slums was not the rare quietness, but the rare cleanliness. The same simple courtyard door was modeled, but there were no mud spots and footprints that were commonly seen in this street. Su Lu quickly stretched out a palm and blocked the courtyard door that was about to close. Looking at the aunt who was wiping her sweat with a towel in the courtyard, he shouted excitedly, "Aunt, I'm back." Aunt Susan heard the voice behind her and was a little confused. She thought that she was really old, otherwise, how could she hear the royal voice that she only had the opportunity to hear when she was a child? She laughed at herself and threw the yellow towel in her hand into the wooden basin beside the well. She subconsciously looked back, and her body stiffened. Her wide palm was supporting her thick waist, and she forgot to take it away. After a long silence, Aunt Susan finally recognized the face under the shadow of the square hat. She screamed in shock and covered her mouth in disbelief. Then she opened her arms, walked quickly to Sulu, and hugged him tightly. The auntie pounded on his back as if she was blaming him for his sudden disappearance back then. It was as if she wanted to beat him until he was severely injured and then put him back in the attic so that he wouldn't suddenly disappear again. No matter how hard she pounded on his back, Sulu just hugged her tightly. His face, which was resting on her fleshy shoulder, revealed a happy smile. At the entrance of the small courtyard, Zhong Huiyan's mouth was wide open. She looked at the scene in front of her in surprise. She vaguely guessed who this fat woman was, but she still couldn't adapt to her seemingly omnipotent brother snuggling with such an ordinary woman like a child. Hugging and rough beating were not enough to express Aunt Susan's surprise at the sudden reunion. She held Su Li's face and looked at him seriously, trying to see what kind of injuries he had suffered over the years. Her thick lips kept moving, and she expressed her concern in the unclear dialect of her hometown. Then, she kissed him fiercely on the face. Sulu also kissed her on the forehead. Because of this kiss, Aunt Susan seemed to have thought of something. The expression on her face suddenly became extremely nervous. She twisted her obese body and rushed to the door like a hurricane. Like a lioness protecting her cub, she vigilantly looked at the alley outside the courtyard and noticed that no one passed by. It was not until she closed the door and inserted the iron rod that she was truly relaxed. Patting her chest heavily like a drum, she turned around and looked at Su Li's face. Rubbing her rough fingers, she asked in a rough voice, "Little guy, are you an exiled noble or a member of the Federation?" After a pause, Aunt Susan tried to make her expression look as fierce as possible. She put her right hand on her waist and threatened in a low voice, "If you are from the Federation, then leave immediately. Otherwise, I might call the police later." Sulu knew this kind auntie too well. He smiled and shrugged. "Auntie, of course I'm not from the Federation. This is my younger sister." He pulled out Zhong Huiyan, who was still in a semi-sluggish state behind him. Aunt Susan looked at the beautiful and lovely girl. For some reason, she nodded with satisfaction. Then she patted Sulu on the back of his head and said, "What are you waiting for? Bring the little girl in for tea." 2 cups of weak tea, steaming hot, and the room was very warm. Aunt Susan was naturally concerned about where he had been and what he had done over the years. Sulu found that he could not answer this question at all. He could not help but feel a little ashamed. Because of shame, his eyes drifted a little. He saw from the corner of his eyes that there was only a pair of chopsticks on the plate of leftovers covered with a gauze umbrella on the small table. He asked doubtfully, "Where is Paul?" He should have graduated from the 2nd university the year before last. Which department is he working in now? Doesn't he usually come back to accompany you? Aunt Susan took out a plate of nuts from the cabinet and kindly pushed it in front of Zhong Huiyan. She looked back at Sulu and explained, "Paul has gone to the front line. Speaking of which, this is really a very troublesome thing. It's also something that makes me very proud. Now the salary is good, but the child sent back 2/3 of his monthly allowance. I'm a little worried that he won't have enough to eat on the front line." The kind-hearted and hot-blooded young man of the Empire, as she feared in the past, had gone to the battlefield full of death and slaughter. Su Li's mood could not help but be a little gloomy. He forced a smile and said to Aunt Susan, "The army's expenses are very low. Don't worry about these problems. Aunt Susan looked at him with a smile and said, "Knowing that you are still alive, I have less to worry about. How many days will you stay this time? Is it convenient?" "I will stay a little longer," Sulu replied with a smile. He did not say any polite words such as troubling the other party. In this small courtyard, in front of a fat woman, any polite words were unforgivable hypocrisy. "How's the market business? Did you hire a few more people?" During this time, Sulu confirmed that Aunt Susan had been living a good life these years. At least, it was much better than the poorest days. There was even a TV in the room. "The business is getting worse and worse. Those high-definition players you made were all copied by those damn guys. Paul and I are not as capable as you." Aunt Susan sighed and said, "Fortunately, Paul's allowance is high now. He asked me to transfer the business directly, but I still feel a little reluctant." Sulu mentioned the parts he had bought at the hardware store, looked at Aunt Susan and said with a smile, "It's okay. Since I am back, I will design a few more three-dimensional players, solder a few physical passwords, and let those guys eat shit." Aunt Susan clapped her hands, laughed loudly, and said in a rough voice, "Of course, that's good. You are a meritorious person. Tell me, what do you want to eat today?" Now that the days are better, I changed a big refrigerator. There is still beef in it. Do you want to eat steak? I want to eat chowder. I can't forget the taste. Sulu said with a smile. Okay. Aunt Susan quickly put on an oversized apron, wiped her greasy hands in front of her, picked up the kitchen knife and went out to the yard to slaughter chickens. Watching the roughback disappear at the door, Zhong Huiyan, who had been silent, turned around and looked at Sulu as if she was looking at a monster. She spread out her hands and shrugged cutely. She asked incredulously, "The most powerful engineer in the universe, assembling pirated high-definition players in the Empire?" Sulu stood up and walked to the yard, ready to help Aunt Susan. After hearing this sentence, he replied with a smile, "Don't look down on this work. This is the source of the annual expenses of this small yard." The white porridge in the big pot exuded a simple and charming fragrance along with the hot steam. The tender fresh vegetables were cut into pieces by the sharp kitchen knife, mixed with the bloody black feather chicken pieces, and a few small red oranges were thrown into the porridge and boiled. After adding a spoonful of spicy seasoning, the steaming chowder completed most of the work. Only some chopped green onions needed to be added later. Aunt Susan refused Su Li's idea of helping and quickly solved all the work. She closed the lid of the pot and clapped her hands happily. She turned to Sulu and asked, "That little girl is very beautiful, but she looks a little young. When are you going to have a child?" Sulu was leaning against the door at this time, looking around the kitchen that he was once very familiar with. His chest and abdomen were full of warm and relaxed emotions. Suddenly, when he heard this question, he nervously stood up and explained, "Don't misunderstand, she is really my sister. I am not blind." Aunt Susan glared at him and said, "How can you have such a beautiful sister?" Sulu was speechless. He thought that it was impossible to judge whether they were related by blood based on this. If Aunt Susan saw Hui Chaosher and Jian Shuier, she would definitely not think that they were sisters. Aunt Susan pinched a handful of fresh onions with water droplets on them. Just as she was about to cut them, her hand that was holding the kitchen knife slowed down. After a moment of silence, she sighed and said, "Back then, you promised me and Paul that you would tell us when you left. Who would have thought that you would disappear so quietly, and for so many years?" Sulu looked at the back of Aunt Susan next to the pot and saw her raise her arm to wipe her tears. His heart was a little sad and he explained in a low voice, "The situation was too tense at that time. I really didn't have time to come back and tell you." Aunt Susan looked back at him worriedly and asked, "Is it related to the army entering the city that day?" all the streets around the White Yard were raised. Yes. Sulu didn't want to hide anything at all, so he answered honestly, I was in the White Yard at that time. Paul insisted that it had nothing to do with you, but I knew at that time that you must be in that yard. Aunt Susan put down the kitchen knife and came forward. She rubbed Suli's head and said, You have to know that we are really worried about you. Sulu forced a smile and said, It's all right. Don't worry. It's all right. Aunt Susan lowered her voice and reprimanded, Do you know that even Her Royal Highness came to this yard later? Although she had other things to do, I know that she must be looking for you. Sulu smiled, took Aunt Susan's hand and said, It's really all right. Her Royal Highness is quite familiar with me now. Aunt Susan was stunned and immediately came to her senses. She spat hard and then slapped his forehead heavily. She laughed and said, This guy has learned to lie and brag now. Sulu covered his aching forehead and said bitterly, This is the truth. Although Her Royal Highness is a good person, she is a noble lady. Don't make fun of her in the future. Aunt Susan said seriously, after she came to the small yard, the guys in the Public Security Bureau no longer dared to take my money. She also never allowed Paul to join the army on the front line. Until last year, Paul went to the military department to make trouble many times. Then he took advantage of the time when Her Royal Highness was not in Tianjin to secretly go to the army. Sulu frowned slightly, not because of pain, but because of doubt. Was White Chowsher taking care of Aunt Susan and Paul so much because of him, or was there another reason? Aunt Susan's next sigh answered his question. Chapter 867. Many years ago, in the distant star field of the West Woods of the Federation, on the planet named 5460, an Empire officer named Arthur was executed by military law because he refused to obey the orders of his superiors to slaughter civilians of the Federation. Then, he was buried in the cold ground with more than 9,000 corpses of civilians of the Federation. This Empire officer named Arthur was Aunt Susan's elder brother. I'm proud of him. Aunt Susan turned around and stirred the chowder porridge in the pot. She wiped the corners of her eyes. She didn't know why, but her nerves, which had been tempered by life, had become so delicate and sensitive today. It was as if she had returned to her happy and beautiful childhood. After the hot and fragrant chowder pot was finished, the quiet small courtyard lit up with soft lights. Sulu rushed Zhong Huyen to wash the dishes. Aunt Susan couldn't persuade him, so she sat down and held his hand to chat. She was concerned about how he had lived these years. At some point, Aunt Susan remembered the story told in the kitchen. She took out a well-preserved diary from the room very carefully and opened it carefully. She continued to talk about her memory of her elder brother and the pride that came from it. This is the diary I gave him when he joined the army. The outside of the diary was a tan coarse calfskin jacket. On the inside page of the plant fiber paper, the content was scribbled in blue-black ink. Sulu silently watched the pages turn one by one in front of him. He didn't tell Aunt Susan that it was he who found her elder brother's body. It was he who brought the diary back to the Empire and returned it to this warm and peaceful small courtyard through White Chowsher. After paying the heavy price of 2 broken bowls, Zhong Huyen finally finished the cleaning work clumsily. She rubbed her red little hands awkwardly and sat back in the chair in the living room. When she saw the scene behind the curtain, she curiously leaned over. Let's play cards for a while. Sulu asked Aunt Susan with a smile. Just like many long nights in the Empire during the escape, the small courtyard began a game of cards that had nothing to do with gambling. The game of the Empire's South Road flower card was really interesting. Zhong Huyen, who replaced Paul, only spent 3 games before she was deeply immersed in it. Late at night, it was quiet. The provocative sounds of wild dogs and wild cats chasing each other began to sound in the alley outside the courtyard, the small bed was still in the corner of the attic. A table was placed next to the wall facing the window. The tools in the drawer were slightly rusty because they had not been used for a long time. Outside the window, beyond the broken eaves of the slums, one could clearly see the white courtyard under the white moonlight in the distance. Zhong Huiyan was lying on her stomach on the bed with her hands under her chin. She looked curiously at Su Lu, who was sitting at the table and working non-stop with tools in his hands. She found that at this time, he, who was not raising his eyebrows or squinting his eyes, finally had the most relaxed and most joyful expression on his face. She could not help but be puzzled. What kind of magic did this small courtyard have that could make him, who was carrying an unimaginable burden, become so calm? She directly asked her doubts. Su Lu put down the 6-star knife and soldering iron in his hands, looked at the HD player parts scattered on the table, and whispered, "At that time, I was in the most dangerous moment of my life. I was seriously injured and in a coma. I was trapped in the Empire's net and could die at any time. Aunt had no reason to take me in, but she took me in without asking for any reason." Su Lu looked back at the girl on the bed and said with a smile, "A place that can let people see hope in despair is heaven. This small courtyard is heaven for me." After a moment of silence in the attic, his rare emotional voice sounded again. "You've seen that diary just now. What you don't know is that this diary followed that young, proud, determined, and gentle imperial officer for 7 years in the treacherous space, and then was buried deep in the mass grave under Glacier 5460 until Shang Qiu and I discovered its existence that year, and then I brought it to the Empire." Zhong Huiyan looked at him in surprise. "I met Arthur, and then I was saved by Arthur's sister in the Empire. Is this fate or fate? I have learned at least one thing in this small courtyard. Humans may be noble and despicable, but this really has nothing to do with race. Aunt Susan and her brother Arthur are both from the Empire, but they are both noble and kind people." He turned back, picked up the 6-star knife and the microprobe soldering iron, and began to focus and silently assemble the HD player again. He lowered his head and said, "Aunt has tidied up Paul's room. You should go to bed quickly. Tomorrow we will go to Master Fan's mansion." Zhong Huiyan sat up from the bed, peeled off the hair rope from her wrist, and quickly tied her silk-like light chestnut straight hair into a cute bun. She said, "I thought the matter over there was important, so we would go to Master Fan's mansion first." Su Li's shoulders sank slightly, and he did not turn back. After a moment of silence, he said, "I have been away for so many years, and I am really scared. I am scared that she is dead." The next day's breakfast was spicy noodles and bean paste buns. Under Aunt Susan's loving gaze, Su Lu ate very happily. Zhong Huiyan, who still had her hair in a bun, looked very happy. Her eyes were smiling, and she smacked her lips inelegantly, but her legs under the table were obviously a little nervous. "I am taking my sister shopping. It is her first time to Tianjing." Su Lu took the hot towel from Aunt Susan and wiped his mouth. He said, "I will pick you up at the market in the afternoon." "Is it still the same old shop?" "Yes." Aunt Susan answered with a smile, cheered up by his words, because it was still early. The uneven roads in the slums and the dirt between the low-quality cement slabs had not carried too much sewage and pressure, so it did not look so dirty. The dusty green trees on the side of the street mixed with the clear morning light, and they actually looked quite beautiful. "If you can't eat, then don't eat." Su Lu looked at Zhong Huiyan beside him and said. Today, the young girl was wearing a black dress with a high open collar. Her hair was in an oval bun, revealing her white neck. It was particularly eye-catching when paired with the collar. The slightly cool morning breeze blew a few strands of hair. It was very beautiful, and there was a kind of youthful sexiness. "I want to please Auntie." Zhong Huiyan giggled. Su Lu smiled and said, "There is no need to be so polite. Hearing this, Zhong Huiyan slowly lowered her head. She did not seem to be in a good mood. She kicked a stone in front of her and complained silently in her heart, "What a big idiot." After walking for a short distance, the white courtyard quietly waited for them on the other side of the road. This courtyard looked very ordinary, but looking at the courtyard walls that extended very far, one could roughly judge that it occupied a large area. The buildings in the courtyard were all luxurious log structures. The buildings were not tall and were hidden in the green trees, silently exuding the smell of thyme. The most conspicuous thing about this courtyard was its color. Sulu silently looked at the messy temporary tents and makeshift houses around the courtyard. He knew that these dilapidated buildings must have been rebuilt after the Imperial Army bulldozed them. He retracted his gaze and looked through the slightly open front door of the courtyard. He saw that whether it was the inner walls or the wooden pillars of the buildings inside, they were all painted in the purest white. It was so white that it made people feel disgusted. It was the time when the flowers bloomed in the spring. Although the morning breeze was cold, it blew bursts of flower fragrance through the walls. It curled around the tall green trees and turned into a wonderful smell that penetrated the nose. Although in the slums, the streets around the white courtyard were as clean as a palace. Even the stray cats and dogs did not get up because of last night's tiredness. Around the courtyard, there were many imperial soldiers and police looking around indifferently. Zhong Huiyan felt the tension and solemnity in the air. She narrowed her eyes and asked, "How do we get in?" Sulu replied, "Walk in." Zhong Huiyan was stunned. Her thin eyebrows slightly furrowed. She looked at him and said, "Brother, you're becoming more and more like a third-rate philosopher. I'm not used to it, and I don't like it." Sulu smiled and said, "I'm telling the truth." After a pause, he explained, "Right now, the entire upper echelon of the Empire knows who we are and where we are. Since that's the case, we can only pay them a visit." After entering the manor of the Great Master, he politely reported his name and accepted the routine security check. Under the guidance of the housekeeper he had met once before, he walked into the depths of the white courtyard. Along the way, there were flowering trees, green trees, and withered trees. He could see stone walls, wooden walls, and projection walls. He could hear the sounds of reading, discussions, and debates coming from the buildings. There should be many scholars of history holding a seminar on the verification of specific historical facts. Several years ago, when he sneaked into the Great Master's manor, it was at night, and when he fled in a hurry, so Sulu did not see more details of this white courtyard. But today, he was not in the mood and spirit to see the most bizarre place in the left sky star region. He was only waiting to meet that guy and ask him some questions. In the innermost part of the white courtyard, the man on the stone steps turned around. His fluttering white robe fluttered in the wind, revealing a pair of dazzling naked legs and a dazzling and perfect face. White streaks of stars could be seen in the tightly tied hair behind his head. His smile was still as shameless as ever. The housekeeper retreated. Sulu looked at the Great Master and could not help but scratch his head. He asked, "Are you waiting for me to come again?" "Of course." The Great Master chuckled and prepared to walk down the stone steps. He said, "Again in the name of love, literature, and peace." Sulu held Zhong Huiyan's small hand and stared at the fluttering white robe around the Great Master's waist. He suddenly thought of an extremely important question. He extended his left hand to cover the girl's eyes and asked in a low voice, "Today, are you wearing underwear?" The Great Master furrowed his handsome eyebrows. Although he was already very old, that beautiful face of his still had a seductive charm. He was like a demon emitting luster. He said bitterly, "I'm not an exhibitionist." Sulu looked at him mockingly. He was about to open his mouth to mock this guy when he suddenly realized that there were a few cold and slender fingers on his left hand. He looked down in shock and saw that Zhong Huiyan had pulled away his hand that was covering her eyes. She looked at the white-robed great master floating down the stone steps. Her bright black eyes sparkled as she shouted in shock and infatuation, "Brother, look at how beautiful this uncle is." Chapter 868. Back then, when Sulu first saw the great teacher's face, he had the urge to smash this face into a pile of mud. It was not because of anything else, but because this face was too beautiful. It was so beautiful that it made people of the same gender envious and jealous. They wanted to stomp their feet and destroy it tirelessly. Therefore, he understood very well how a young girl growing up in the spring breeze would be shocked when she saw this face. But when he saw that little watermelon, who had always regarded him as her idol, was actually looking at another man, even though he was an old man, he couldn't help but feel unhappy. He pulled the girl to his side with a sullen face and warned her, "Don't be fooled by his looks. He's actually a lunatic." Zhong Huiyan obviously did not care about his warning. She crossed her arms in front of her chest and looked at the great teacher without blinking. She sighed and said, "Even if he is a lunatic, he must be the most beautiful lunatic in the universe." "I say, uncle, how did your face grow?" The great teacher looked at the two of them proudly and said, "Cute little princess from the West Woods, this is a secret. If you want to know, we can talk more during this period of time." "Isn't that disgusting?" Sulu frowned and looked at him. "Since you are old enough to be her grandfather, don't pretend to be those wretched uncles." After entering the house, there were 3 cups of tea and a plate of snacks. It was a very simple reception. Sulu sat cross-legged on the dark wooden floor and nodded slightly as a greeting. Then, he began the most important matter of this trip, asking questions. "My first question is, where did Feng Yu go after returning to the Empire with you?" "Sister said that she got off the spaceship early. In the end, he and you returned to Tianjing planet together." Great Teacher Fan gently held the 2 corners of his white robe and shook it forward to cover his bare legs. He picked up the red mud teacup from the short table and slowly took a sip. Only when Sulu was about to lose his patience did he answer, "I don't know where Feng Yu went. You know that cowardly and shameless teacher of yours, but he is just a little stronger than me. I have to admit that I can't beat him. Furthermore, I owed him a favor last time, so I was too embarrassed to ask Fu Chai for help. Once he helped me, it would be a fight to the death. It doesn't suit my style." Sulu leaned forward slightly and asked, "What about that ship? Are you on that ship?" "It's the ship that your father took to the Federation, the same ship that the female ancestor of the Hua family took to cross the Milky Way to the Empire." "It seems that Shiki-chan didn't give you an answer. After all, she hasn't experienced this before." Master Fan put down the teacup and sighed with a lingering regret. "The appearance is the same as my Hua family's boat, so it should be that one." But Nasri did not lie on the wetland. The most important chips should have been removed and used to make those camouflage chips. It is precisely for this reason that I am too lazy to ask him for the boat back. Zhong Huiyan interrupted with a teasing smile, "Is it because you can't beat him?" Master Fan opened his eyes wide and said, "This has nothing to do with fists. That was originally my family's boat. Although my father gave it to that guy, if I really wanted it, would he have the nerve to not give it to me?" Sulu listened to the quarrel between the old man and the young man. His right hand slowly touched his left wrist. His fingertips gently slid across the surface of the warm metal bracelet, feeling the psychological touch brought by the small line of words. He thought silently that most of the chips that Feng Yu removed should be in this bracelet. What about the star map? Last time, in the room full of black cloth, you told me that you know where the star map is and what the star map is. He looked at the great teacher's beautiful eyes that were like black gemstones and asked in a low voice, "Those chips won't fundamentally affect the control of the spaceship?" If we get the star map again, can it fly back? The content of this sentence was a little strange, or rather, the way he asked the question was a little strange. If the spaceship could fly back, where did it go back? Master Fan slowly sat up straight and looked at Su Li's face silently. After a while, he said, although I said it before, I didn't expect you to have guessed most of the puzzle. I can only say that after such a long journey, the spaceship can no longer cross the galaxy as bravely and valiantly as it did in the beginning. After a short pause, he continued calmly, the content of the star map is similar to what you guessed. I also told you where the star map was last time, but you didn't get it back to me. It's very difficult for me to return to the Federation now, especially the capital ring. The ground-to-air defense system there has been greatly improved. I have no doubt that if I tried to get close to the old moon base, would be directly blown to pieces by those ground-to-air laser cannons. Master Fan smiled and lamented, the last time I went to the Federation, I didn't get to see my beautiful niece. Other than regret, not being able to get the star map is the biggest loss. Fortunately, neither Li Jiedu nor the lady behind Macho know that the star map is hidden in the bracelet on her wrist. Su Lu looked at the thick soup in the red clay teacup in silence. His fingertips slowly moved away from the bracelet on his left wrist. It seems that you have a lot of questions to ask after coming all the way to Tianjing to find me. Master Fan smiled and looked at him. Nasri, the spaceship, the star map, what do you want to know? I want to know the origin of the Empire, what is going on with the ancestral planet, and if the Hua family came from the ancestral planet, how did you get here? Su Lu looked back into his eyes and said, due to some reasons that are inconvenient for me to explain, I am very interested in some of the technology that the Hua family brought from the ancestral planet. First of all, you need to make one thing clear. At least half of the blood flowing in your body carries the biological mark of the Hua family. Since you're unwilling to admit that your surname is Huai, then you should at least admit that this is our Hua family, and not some fucking Hua family. Master Fan looked at him, frowned, and said, if I tell you this, then what interesting information do you have to give back to me? Now, we can basically confirm that the Federation and the Empire came from the same civilization. You are so obsessed with the future of the Empire, then where did the people of the Federation come from? Su Lu put his hands on his knees and looked down. Seeing that the tea in the cup had calmed down, he calmed down and looked straight into Master Fan's eyes. He said, yes, I do know some things recently. Do you want to know? Master Fan's face was expressionless. He dipped his finger into the teacup, dipped it in some of the cold tea, and then put it into his ear, scratching it in an extremely ungraceful manner. The old, middle-aged, and young people in the room sat cross-legged. There were 3 red mud teacups on the dark sandalwood floor. It was just a scene of sitting and chatting. However, because of the content that was about to be discussed, because of Master Fan's ear scratching, the atmosphere in the quiet room suddenly became heavy. The wooden door closed on its own, cutting off the fragrance of flowers, the morning breeze, and the distant voices of people outside. It was because at this moment, they were going to talk about the origins of the Federation and the Empire that no one knew about. This was, without a doubt, the biggest topic of all, the heaviest topic of all. I don't trust your way of doing things, but I trust your conduct in life. I ask that you keep this topic a secret. Otherwise, if it gets back to the Federation, it will definitely cause a lot of trouble. After saying this, Su Lu silently stopped talking. He moved back and gave the authority to narrate the story to Zhong Huiyan, who had been silent all this time. The reason for this was probably because he felt that his ability to express himself was not enough to use the simplest words to describe the scene. Zhong Huiyan drank a mouthful of tea and moistened her throat. She said in a clear voice, according to the records in the central database of the Federation, wait a moment. The great teacher raised a finger and interrupted her. He looked at Su Lu and asked, from what the little girl is saying, after you escaped from the Federation, you were still able to enter the charter computer. Zhong Huiyan frowned slightly and said, Sir, can you be a little more polite? Even in class, you can't just randomly interrupt my content. It was obvious that the girl had returned to the memories of her role as a village teacher. She glanced at the embarrassed great teacher and continued, before the great catastrophe, when the home planet was destroyed by some kind of terrifying weapon, the humans at that time had been preparing for interstellar migration. And this was the beginning of this story. The civilization of the previous generation was obviously more advanced than ours. With the support of powerful technology, their spaceships were able to pass through the dark sky and ignore the long vacuum between the big galaxies. They came to the galaxy where the Federation was located. Then, with great luck, they found a few planets that were very suitable for human survival. Since they were preparing for interstellar migration, then the modification of the planets had been ongoing since the beginning. The humans of the previous generation had been preparing for a very long time. It could have been thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, or even longer. They chose 3 planets, S1, S2, and S3, as experimental planets and carried out a long period of natural environment cultivation and modification work. It was also because of the factor of luck that the distance between the 3 experimental planets and the main stars of their respective galaxies was perfect. The surface covered by the primitive atmosphere could enjoy enough and suitable light. Zhong Huiyan calmly explained, so, the humans of that time didn't need to wear spacesuits and stand on the black reef shouting for light. The first thing they needed to do was to modify the atmosphere that was full of methane and simultaneously eliminate the primitive moss life on the 3 experimental planets. This is a very simple description, but we all know that what we can explain in a few words is a very huge comprehensive project for human society, even for the advanced civilization of the previous generation. It required a terrifying amount of resources and the lifetime efforts of generations of the most advanced scientists. Originally, I wanted to make some slides and use images to describe the development of this great civilization, but that would take too much time. Zhong Huiyan continued, according to the vague records in the central database of the Federation, the modification of the 3 planets by the previous civilization mostly relied on the automatic control of the spaceships. Only machines that ignored the passage of time to a certain extent could travel with the spaceships across the boundless galaxy. Imagine the picture. Countless spaceships that carried the most advanced hubs of the mechanical civilization took off from the surface of the home planet incessantly like arrows. With unstoppable determination and disdain for time, they flew to the other end of the dark universe. Master Fan clenched his hands and exclaimed excitedly, "That was a magnificent era." Chapter 869. Regardless of whether it was the era when the ignorant Federation and the Imperium burst into countless fireworks every time they met in the stars, the era when the military god Li Bufu led the soldiers of the Federation into the left heaven space zone and assassinated the Emperor of the Imperium in the middle of thousands of soldiers, or the era when the flames of war continued incessantly and the young heroes shed blood to change their identities. Compared to the soul-stirring interstellar migration tens of thousands of years ago, it was just a scene in history that could be easily washed away. That was the great era when intelligent life society had a system to march into the universe. It was the great era when humans tried to leave their homeland and fundamentally changed the form of life. It was a great era that changed the appearance of the entire universe. Su Lo understood the great teacher's agitated reaction very well. He silently watched as the great teacher kept slapping his bare thighs, but he did not have any intention of stopping his indecent actions. It was because he had a similar reaction when he first heard Philip tell him about that ancient story for the first time more than 10 days ago. Zhong Huanhua watched as the great teacher gradually calmed down and continued. After the adjustment of the atmosphere was completed, the removal of the low-level anaerobic alien moss was naturally accelerated. Then, the transplanting of plants, all kinds of trees, and all kinds of flowers. I don't think the scientists at that time even forgot about fungi, bacteria, and the like. Then, of course, there were animals. For example, the bison and white birds you saw in the Federation's wetlands were probably the descendants of the animals that crossed the galaxy before humans and scattered on the 3 experimental planets like seeds. In short, there were a lot of them. This was a full replication of the biological library of the ancestral planet. According to the records of the central database, the method of selection of the previous civilization was similar to letting the animals, plants, and even smaller life forms coexist, compete, compromise, and help each other on the 3 experimental planets. Humans did not exert any influence on them. Under the influence of time, life stubbornly survived. The ecosystem completed a strong self-recovery, and the life system of the entire planet began a new cycle. No one could tell how long this long process took, but humans finally obtained the possibility of interstellar migration. The great teacher, who had been silent for a while, frowned, raised his finger, and suddenly interrupted, "This is the way of the Creator." The humans of the previous civilization were not creators. Although their technology was very advanced, they still could not do this. After a moment of silence, Sulu said, "The real creator is the natural environment, and a long period of time. Of course, it also includes life itself." "All right, I agree with you." Master Fan turned to look at Zhong Huiyan and said with emotion, "Every story always needs to ask 3 words. What happened next?" Interstellar migration had already become a reality, but large-scale migration was something that the society at that time could not support. It still needed a period of accumulation. However, at that time, the war that we talked about at the beginning, which is also known as the catastrophe in the Federation's history, arrived on that planet. The planet was reduced to a scorched earth, and mankind was destroyed by the terrible bombs that they developed. At the last moment before the end of the civilization, 5 top scientists who had been involved in the interstellar migration project were lucky enough to activate the last intact spaceship in the base. They broke through the strange lead clouds brought by the war, passed through the dark sky, and successfully arrived at 3 planets without any human beings. They were completely animal paradises. Then it must be a group of 5. The great teacher frowned and asked, "The problem is, since there were no humans on the 3 experimental planets, could it be that these 5 scientists were the ancestors of all the people of the Federation?" There was only one female in the group of 5, and the books I read mentioned her age. Even if the previous civilization was preserved to a certain extent on that spaceship, I don't think she could have given birth to a child that could carry on the fire of humanity. Sulu explained, according to the records of the charter computer, the last spaceship was classified as an extension model in the migration project. This means that there might be an embryo bank, a biological marker bank, or something like that on that spaceship. That's really lucky. Master Fan could not hide his shock. After a while, he had a new question. He stared at Feng Luo and asked, "But even if there is an embryo bank, how do you cultivate it?" Sulu shrugged. "There should be some kind of equipment that can complete this task." Speaking of which, the Bureau of Proclamation of the Federation has always been leading the entire universe in the field of biotechnology, but it is strictly confidential. Other than the production of protein-synthesized meat, it is forbidden to use it in any military aspect. I'm wondering if it has something to do with this. It sounds a little disgusting. Master Fan grumbled a few words. He picked up the cold tea in front of him and drank it in one gulp. Beads of sweat flowed down his forehead. He said mockingly, "So, other than being test tube babies, the people of the Federation are also made by machines. Is this important?" Sulu asked seriously. "It's fine as long as they are alive." Master Fan thought for a while and answered seriously, "It is indeed not important. Don't ask me where that spaceship is." Sulu looked at his eager appearance and stopped him in advance. "That spaceship no longer exists." The main control computer is now the Federation's charter computer. The parts of the spaceship have been dismantled and are now under the Bureau of Proclamation as the core protection layer of the charter computer. Master Fan sighed again. A spaceship computer, in our era, can become the shining existence above the entire Federation and make the entire Empire fear it. That civilization of the previous generation is really unimaginably powerful. After knowing these things, I've been thinking that perhaps it was because the technology of the previous generation was too advanced that led to the catastrophe later. Sulu stretched out his hand and gently turned the red mud teacup. He said in a low voice, "The whole interstellar migration project cost a lot of money. The resources of the entire ancestral planet dried up because of this. The social conflicts intensified, and the ideologies clashed. Then, an extremely cruel and desperate war broke out. Both sides had technology and weapons that we can't imagine. Once the war started, it was impossible to end it." Master Fan sighed and said, "That is not something we can understand." "That's about all that we know about the Federation," Li Tianlong said. Sulu raised his head and looked into his eyes. "As an exchange of information, it's your turn to tell the story of the Left Sky Star region. With your story as a blueprint, the story of the Left Sky Star region will be much easier to tell." Master Fan looked at the two of them and slowly said, "Ever since our ancestors came to the Left Sky Star region, our Master Fan Manor has been studying all kinds of original data for more than 700 years. Now, we can confirm one thing, and that is that the civilization of the Left Sky Star region must have originated from the ancestral planet. As you said, the ancestral planet of the previous generation was not a monolithic entity. There must be different factions at odds, or else such a desperate war would not have happened. Since the technological level of both sides is similar, when the faction of the five-man group was planning the interstellar migration, the other faction must also be making the relevant preparations, and they must be hiding it from each other. When the five-man group took the last spaceship to S1, the other faction, which was in a state of destruction, also took a spaceship to the experimental planet they chose, or should I say, the ranch. However, the humans who came to the Left Sky Star region were clearly not as prepared as the five-man group, so although they had more people and more spaceships, the process of exploring the universe was much more difficult. The Left Sky Star region was like a black hole, constantly swallowing those desperate or brave pioneers. In this process, the technology of the previous generation continued to disappear along with the loss of human life, which also led to the current empire's technological level falling behind that of the Federation. Although this is not the decisive factor, the influence is very far-reaching. What is the decisive factor? Zhong Huiyan asked, puzzled. The decisive factor is that your charter computer has been intentionally or unintentionally controlling the development of the Federation's technology. The great teacher looked at the young lady and said calmly, "The Empire does not have such restrictions, so it has been chasing after each other for tens of thousands of years." Fortunately, when the two sides met again, the gap was already very small. Sulu was silent, thinking about the distant barbaric era, the fleeing humans who took a spaceship to the Left Sky Star region, facing the unfamiliar and dangerous planets, yet stubbornly survived. He could not help but feel a chill, and then he was filled with endless respect. The survivors of the previous generation civilization could only rely on their numbers and relatively backward navigation to fight against the dangerous universe. It is also because of this reason that the Left Sky Star region's policy of encouraging reproduction has never changed for tens of thousands of years. According to statistics, the current empire has over 90 billion registered citizens, but the actual number of people far exceeds this. The great teacher spread out his hands and said, "Both are interstellar immigrants, but due to the slight differences at the very beginning, it leads to the differences in many aspects of the two human societies. However, at the end of the day, both the Federation and the Empire have taken an extremely similar path. After all, we are all survivors of the same race and origin. It's just that before we met, both sides did not know that there were companions on the other side of the universe. This beautiful man slowly closed his eyes and then slowly opened them again. He looked at the two of them and said solemnly, "Could it be that the destiny of humans is to split up and then be destroyed together? Could it be that the Federation and the Empire are going to repeat the fate of the humans on the ancestor planet from countless tens of thousands of years ago? I am now more and more certain that the Federation and the Empire do not need anything else but peace." Hearing the word peace, Sulo was silent for a very long time. He did not give any direct response to the great teacher's firm declaration, but asked expressionlessly, "The problem now is that the Hua family is not from the Empire. You came from the ancestor planet, which means that after the catastrophe, the ancestor planet did not become a ruin of absolute death. There are still humans who survived. Then, what is the ancestor planet like now? I know what you're worried about." The great teacher shook his head and said, "Time can erase too many memories. How the ancestors came to the left sky star region from the ancestor planet is only left with some almost mythical records in this white courtyard. However, you can rest assured that the civilization on the ancestor planet is far from the civilization of the previous generation. Naturally, there won't be any battleships carrying terrifying weapons coming from the other side of the dark sky curtain to wipe out the Empire and the Federation. The civilization has not recovered." Sulo asked, "Then, what about the ship that the Hua family's ancestors were on? That ship should also be a remnant of the previous generation's civilization. No matter how terrifying the catastrophe was, there should be some advanced things left behind on that planet that was once filled with the fruits of the previous generation's civilization." The great teacher continued to explain, "After the ancestor came to the left sky star region, she never left. This means that even she did not have the ability to repair that ship to the extent that it could pass through the dark sky curtain again and return to the ancestor planet. A woman from a backward civilization taking the advanced spaceship of the previous generation's civilization and resolutely heading to an unfamiliar star region. This is equivalent to a baby picking up an advanced rifle and pulling the trigger on a mecha without hesitation." Zhong Huiyen's eyes were wide open as she said in shock, "Furthermore, she successfully arrived at the left sky star region and shot through the cockpit of that mecha. This is truly inconceivable." The great teacher smiled and said, "That's why the Hua family's ancestors taught us that the truly ferocious characters in the world are all women." Chapter 870. The stories that needed to be told and the context that needed to be clarified were clearly laid out on the dark wooden floor through the three people's casual narration. The room returned to silence. The three people sitting cross-legged on the floor did not open their mouths like the red clay teacups in front of them. Instead, they were as silent as the teacups. After a long time, the great teacher once again pulled his soft white robe down to cover the slender legs that had been exposed due to his excitement. He looked at Su Lo and Zhong Huiyan and asked with an indescribable emotion, "I say, for such a big matter, such an important matter, the three of us are like idlers who have nothing to do after eating, sitting on the sofa and talking about celebrity scandals. Wouldn't that seem disrespectful to history and disrespectful to our predecessors? What else can we do?" Sulud lowered his head and replied in a muffled voice, "Are we going to hold a joint press conference between the two sides of the universe and invite Hui Fuchai and Pabre to attend together?" Zhong Huiyan looked at the great teacher's face and added harshly, "Are we going to invite Jian Shui to sing for fun while Her Highness and Mad Manly operate mechas and dance in front? I just feel that the importance of the discussion and the atmosphere of the discussion are too big." Great teacher Fan laughed bitterly and then looked at Su Lo and said seriously, "However, there are still many details in these stories that have not been clarified. As the only comparative literature researcher in the Federation, you know that I value these details very much. The details decide everything. It's fine. I still want to stay here for a while." Su Lo replied, as for those details, I think there should be some historical materials in this courtyard. I want to take a look. No problem. After all, the blood of the Hua family flows in your body. Great Teacher Fan frowned slightly and looked at him. However, before opening up these historical materials, I have a question. Based on your personality, why are you suddenly so interested in the history of the Empire and the Federation? In other words, we have now clarified some of the historical clues. What is the significance of this to you? Su Lu was silent for a moment, then looked up and sincerely replied, I don't know. As you said, I am a guy who doesn't have the spirit of exploration. I may be curious about those ancient stories, but I don't have the desire to follow and explore. Master Fan nodded and said in a regretful tone, on the contrary, that little Tai Yuan you introduced me to should be more interested in these stories. However, I heard that he wants to run for president of the Federation, so we can't expect too much from him. Why? Su Lu asked in confusion. The difference between a politician and an explorer is like the difference between a cat and a dog, Master Fan replied. After a short pause, he stared into Su Li's eyes and suddenly said, I think I understand why you are suddenly interested in these things. It is because ever since your identity was exposed, you have been wandering in the universe for years without a clear identity. This kind of confusion is very dangerous, and you want to solve this problem. Su Li's eyes slowly narrowed, and his pupils gradually shrank. He said, What do you mean? You want to prove something. You want to prove that since the people of the Empire Federation are all from the ancestral planet, then they are all humans. The great teacher looked straight into his eyes and said calmly, If that is the case, then it is no longer important whether you are a person of the Federation or a person of the Empire. Only then can your state of mind be truly peaceful. Perhaps, but I am not one of those philosophers who like to ask and have the willpower to think about where I came from. I am not even a third-rate philosopher. Su Lu glanced at Zhong Huiyan and continued, Other than some reasons that I cannot tell you, I really don't understand why I am suddenly interested in these things. However, I have a vague feeling that these stories may be very important to me, and to many people. For Su Lu, the library was a place with deep memories. The libraries of Tennessee State University and Ua University had occupied a very important place in his short life. In the past 2 years of traveling in the various prefectures of the empire, he had also visited many historical libraries with royal prefixes and collected many books. A small portion of those books filled the simple classroom in Sanku town, while most of them were randomly thrown in a secluded corner of the spaceship. However, he knew that the library in this white courtyard was definitely completely different from the libraries he had seen before. It was because history was stored here and secrets were hidden here. Otherwise, why would those heavy black cloths still be floating in the room that he had visited before? The wooden door slowly slid open, revealing the layers of black cloths that were trembling slightly in the wind. Thousands of files of various styles were neatly arranged in the space separated by the black cloths. Because no one had read them for many years, the thick books exuded a deathly stillness. This is the family rule set by the ancestor. For some reason, she likes the black cloths very much. Master Fan pointed at the black cloths hanging straight in the spacious room and explained to the two people behind him, although the ancestor has passed away for hundreds of years, no one dares to disobey her rules. Su Lu took off his shoes and put on the prepared white footwear. He walked into the quiet room. Zhong Huiyan placed his shoes neatly outside the door and then quickened her pace to follow him. Master Fan accompanied them to the second door and refused to go in again. In his words, he had read these lifeless records since he was young, and there were too many bad memories in his mind. He did not want to repeat the torture. However, just before he left, he suddenly looked into Su Li's eyes and said, I found the answer to the question. Su Lu asked, What? Peace. Master Fan's smile was like a flower. You want peace. Only now did Sulu understand why he was suddenly interested in these secrets. After a moment of silence, he replied, "If I don't think about what I did on the battlefield, if I don't think about the discussion I had with Commander Zhong about whether or not the progress of the war has been reached, whether or not I am a third-rate philosopher, I must admit that I am in a crack right now. The reason I am not returning to the Federation is because I cannot find a solution to this problem. Because of my identity, I do not have any leeway to choose." His eyebrows, as thick as ink, were still as straight as a blade. His expression was still calm, but at this moment, he appeared particularly serious. He looked into the great teacher's eyes and said, "I can only hope that the two sides can achieve peace. What if they can't? In a limited space, both sides need resources, especially the current Federation. However, when the Federation seizes enough resources and grows stronger, what will the Empire do? Will a lion with a new set of sharp teeth let go of the prey in its mouth? If the Empire survives and begins to counterattack, will the wolves whose homes have been destroyed give up their desire for revenge? If the war between the Empire and the Federation is destined to continue forever and tragically, what will you do? What can you do? Like the tragic hero in the 8-part opera, sacrifice your life for this tragic fate." In front of the heavy and drooping black cloth, the great teacher's calm tone was like a bullet without feeling, pressing forward coldly and valiantly. Sulu looked at him and replied, "I am not that kind of person. If I had the strength or power of the 8-part opera's hero, I would have killed the Emperor directly and ended that war. Killing an emperor can only end one war, and as long as human society is in a state of division, there will never be only one war. No one can control the world after death. It is even impossible to deduce what effect one's current actions will have on the world after death. Therefore, I can only be responsible for the world I am alive in." "Very good. A few years ago, I locked you and Xiao Shi in this courtyard because I wanted to do this. I am very happy that you can now return to the right track." The great teacher looked at him with a smile that was not a smile and said, "In my opinion, you have always wanted to kill Pabre, regardless of whether it is for the sake of the girl beside you or for any other reason. Now, you seem to have an extremely powerful reason, and that is to end the war. Then, can you tell me, when do you plan to return to the Federation and kill Pabre? Pabre is not the Emperor. Killing him will not end this war, and I am not the creator. I can use absurd reasons like finding him an eyesore to kill him, but I will not be so hypocritical as to use the reason of universal peace to kill him. If you can kill Pabre, then I am willing to take the risk to kill your father, and the real Emperor will cooperate with you." Sulu was stunned for a moment before he understood what the great teacher was saying. His thick brows slowly furrowed as he looked at him and said in confusion, "Just now, you said that chatting is a bit unfair to the grand interstellar migration story. Is it not so frivolous for us to talk about this while standing barefoot in front of the black cloth? Can you give me some slightly more feasible and normal suggestions? Killing the President of the Federation and the Emperor of the Empire is, without a doubt, the simplest and most direct way to end this war. My suggestion is very feasible." The great teacher looked at him and shook his head. He sighed and said, "It is a pity that you are afraid of being accused of being hypocritical and are unwilling to accept the former. Student Fu Chai is also your biological father." Sulu frowned and was speechless. "Back then, I once told you that, according to a distant and almost blurred legend, although my ancestor was the biggest war oligarch, he was also the person who hated war the most." "War oligarch?" "That's right. He is the father of the female ancestor of the Hua family. It seems very complicated. It's more complicated than you think." The great teacher Fan waved his hand and continued, "Based on family teachings, both my father and I have been thinking about a way to end this war. My father's idea is to carry out racial integration, which is also the seed plan that the Federation mentioned, especially the fusion of the blood of the royal family and the Federation. My idea is another type of integration. Back then, I thought that if you and Xiao Shi could get married, that would be the best thing that could happen. Unfortunately, you are no longer the successor of the Federation's military god. Instead, you have become her biological younger brother. The great teacher Fan looked at Su Lu, whose expression was somewhat ugly. He smiled and said, "But I heard that President Pobre has a daughter called Miss Dell. This young girl fanatically worships you. Do you want to try dating her?" The Federation president has become the father-in-law of the Empire's crown prince. How can this war continue? Sulu spread out his hands helplessly and said with a sigh, "Other than the reproductive revolution, can you think of something else?" Chapter 871. Lifting up the black cloth, they walked into the pile of historical papers belonging to the mysterious Hua family. The carefully designed window allowed sunlight to pass through but not piquing eyes, making this secluded journey particularly warm. However, Su Lu and Zhong Huiyan did not stay in this room for too long. When the sun began to emerge from the window and was about to change its name to sunset, they walked out. Master Fan held the teapot, closed his eyes, and sat peacefully and happily on the bamboo recliner under the big tree. He seemed to have forgotten the humiliating time when Feng Yu threw him naked on the tree. Hearing the sound of footsteps behind him, he opened his eyes and looked sideways. He asked in surprise, "Finished reading so quickly?" Master Fan's family history in the Empire is more than 700 years. Of course, it's impossible to finish reading it so quickly. In fact, I've only read half of that female ancestor's mood diary. But time is up, so I have to leave. Su Lu replied. Leave? Where are you going? The Federation. Master Fan asked with a frown. Su Lu answered, "We're going to the market. We'll come back tomorrow." Master Fan slapped his thigh heavily, leaving an angry palm print on his white and tender skin. He cursed a famous line from Schiller's early comedy script. "Come back tomorrow. What do you think my place is? A public toilet. You think you can come and go as you please?" Su Lu had read this script. He smiled and did not explain too much. Holding Zhong Huiyan's hand, they walked out of the white courtyard briskly under Master Fan's scolding. The setting sun cast countless oblique shadows on the shabby streets of the slums. The two of them walked in these shadows. They passed through the alleys under 3 locust trees and arrived at the market. Under the curious gazes of the surrounding stalls, they arrived at Aunt Susan's shop. The steaming dinner, the warm atmosphere, and the quiet night in the small courtyard of the slum seemed so warm. After eating to their heart's content, it was Zhong Yanhua's turn to wash the dishes unwillingly but still with a sweet smile on her face. After chatting for a while, the 3-person game of the Imperial South Road flower card began fiercely again until late into the night. In the attic, Su Lu quietly assembled the improved HD video player. His fingers, which did not seem to be very nimble, were as stable and precise as a machine. At an unbelievable speed, he turned the scattered components into a good toy that the young masters of the noble families in the capital of the empire could not help but feel sore again. For him, being able to occasionally smell the smell of machinery in such a peaceful day was a very happy thing, just like chatting about cards during dinner. Zhong Huiyan was lying on her stomach on the small bed. She supported her chin with her hands and her legs were bouncing up and down mischievously. Her beautiful eyes, which were like black gemstones, were quietly focused on Su Lu, who was sitting beside the table. Men are sexiest when they're working hard. It seemed that the women's magazine she read when she was young said so, the young girl thought. Brother, when you were sleeping under the sun in Master Fan's manor during the day, I carefully read the mood diary. I increasingly feel that the ancestor of the Hua family was an amazing woman. Su Lu carefully placed the soldering iron on the metal blade of the 6-star knife. He turned back to look at the young girl on the bed. After a moment of silence, he replied, I don't want you to become such an amazing woman. Why? Zhong Huiyan rolled up from the bed. She opened her eyes wide and looked back at him very seriously. Su Lu knew how to answer. From the last time he met Huai Chaoshi, Zhong Huiyan yearned for that kind of life, that kind of valiant life, but, Su Lu thought for a moment. He looked at her and said gently, whether it's the ancestral planet, the Federation, or the Empire, many things may have changed on the surface, but in fact, there are many things that haven't changed. One of the most important things is the relationship between men and women. Why are there so few women like the ancestor of the Hua family or Huai Chaoshi? Because it's very hard, and I don't want you to live too hard. The small talk was just an interlude. He didn't know if the young girl had a sleepless night downstairs. In any case, Su Lu slept very soundly. It was as if he had returned to the time when he was seriously injured and fleeing. It was in this attic that he felt a sense of security and relaxation. In the days that followed, this kind of happy life was repeated. When he woke up early in the morning, Su Lu often saw the young girl selling masked flowers behind the morning rain alley. Sometimes he would stick his head out of the attic window and shout. Then he would throw out the chestnuts he had eaten last night with banknotes. They would fall at the girl's feet. Then he would put a large bouquet of fragrant white flowers on the stone steps of the door. Every time this happened, Zhong Huiyan would squat by the well in the kitchen and brush her teeth angrily. She didn't know why she was angry. Su Lu wanted to go into the kitchen to help his aunt prepare dinner, but she stubbornly refused to look at him or give way. Her mouth was full of white foam, and her cheeks were very round. It was very cute. After breakfast, Su Lu rode an electric tricycle, hitched a ride with Zhong Huiyan and the high-definition video player he had made last night, and went to the market. After rolling up the heavy rolling gate, he took Zhong Huiyan's hand and went to the great teacher to bury himself in the pile of old books again. No matter how the young girl threw at him, he smiled and refused to let go. The great teacher Fan mansion was very quiet and the sun was very good. The great teacher was angry, helpless, and numb. He was too lazy to care about the siblings, so Su Lu had a very good environment. He slept soundly under the clear sunshine to make up for the hard work of working overtime last night. As for the pile of old books that might carry many secrets, naturally, the very interested Zhong Huiyan examined them carefully. The sun was setting again, and they returned to the small courtyard. Late at night, Aunt Susan slept soundly with a smile on her face. Su Lu was working in the attic. Zhong Huiyan began to talk about the useful information and interesting things that she had seen in the great teacher Fan mansion during the day. Most of the interesting things were related to the female ancestor of the Hua family. She copied a poem in the pages of the Imperial Geographical Record. The author was called Li Ji. The note said that the author was also a woman. But the problem is that I used the great teacher Fan mansion search instrument for a long time, but I couldn't find such a person in the history of the imperial literature. I suspect that this female poet named Li Ji should be a character from the ancestral planet. Brother, are you listening? Yes. Listen carefully to this poem, near to the far east and west, deep to the shallow clear stream. High to the sun and moon, close to family and distant husband and wife. It's really well written. Zhong Huiyan sat on the bed and leaned against the wall. She stared at Su Li's back without blinking and said, close to family and distant husband and wife. You and Sister Shui, are only engaged, but you haven't married yet. You can't say that you're close to her. It's been almost 3 years, and she hasn't said anything about looking for you. Su Lu didn't turn around. He smiled and said, then are you going to let Shang Qiu or Nan Xiangmei be your sister-in-law? Hearing this answer, Zhong Huiyan twisted her fingers and bit the corner of her lips. She was angry and didn't say anything. Life was just like that. It was dull, warm, and safe. No one came to disturb them, including the Imperial Palace. There was no follow-up news. Today, Sulo was no longer the fugitive of the Federation. He was the only male heir of the Imperial family. Therefore, he didn't need to fear the secret agents everywhere in Tianjing, and the chip detectors that could be found everywhere. However, on such a happy day, under the warm sun of the Empire, he couldn't help but miss everything about the Federation. He missed his friends over there. He was very happy, so he hoped that they could be happy too. There was a faint shadow in his happy life. According to the usual practice, Paul's monthly allowance would be transferred to Aunt Susan's account around the 12th. However, it was already the 20th of this month, and the number in the bank account still hadn't changed. When Aunt Susan was cooking, she was obviously a little absent-minded, and she lost even more when playing the South Road flower card. You don't have to worry, I know some news from the front line. There hasn't been a big war in Imo Planet for 2 months. Moreover, the front line is too far from here, so the communication of information is not smooth. It's normal for the allowance to be sent back a few days later. Aunt Susan shook her head, looked at Sulo, and said, that child signed an allowance distribution agreement with the military logistics department before he went to the front line. Now, a large part of his allowance will be automatically deducted every month and transferred from the department to my account. All of it is electronically transferred. He only needs to make an electronic signature confirmation at the front line. It's impossible for him to be delayed by the journey. The fact that the allowance hasn't arrived yet can only mean that the logistics department hasn't gotten his electronic signature confirmation. Sulo continued to comfort her. This doesn't mean anything. If Paul is really in the personal guard camp, then the straight-line distance between him and Her Royal Highness won't be more than 2 kilometers. It's impossible for him to be in too much danger. As for the delay in the electronic signature confirmation, it may be because Her Royal Highness is out on patrol or something like that. He has to follow her all the way and doesn't have time to deal with it. I hope so. Aunt Susan forced a smile. If comfort was useful, there wouldn't be so many sad love songs in the world. What's more, a mother and son's heart were connected. Once the worry started, it couldn't be stopped. Countless terrible conjectures made Aunt Susan toss and turn at night, unable to sleep peacefully. Perhaps it was because she caught a cold. In the quiet night below the small courtyard, from time to time, there were painful coughs that couldn't be suppressed. Sulo put on his pajamas, gently walked down the attic, and went into the kitchen to boil water. He took out a pear from the refrigerator, peeled it, put it into a bowl, put it in the pot, and waited quietly for the pear to be steamed. Then, he slowly raised it in warm water for Aunt Susan to eat when she got up tomorrow. The next morning, Aunt Susan habitually went to the market to sell goods with her sick body. She was stopped by Sulo, fed her medicine, and then returned to the small courtyard from Master Fan Manor early at noon. The steamed pear in the kitchen was still on the stove, still warm, but Aunt Susan was gone. There was a note left by the stove with 2 lines of scribbled handwriting on it. Because of some inconvenient reasons, we can only ask you to meet us in this way. I believe that this is enough to show our sincerity and determination. Sulo slowly clenched his right hand, and the note in his palm shattered under the pressure of an invisible force. He looked back at the clean wooden door of the small courtyard, and his eyes slowly narrowed with a murderous look. He thought blankly, someone is forcing me to kill someone again. Chapter 872. The noon sun was scorching hot. Su Li's current mood was like the bright sunlight on the street. On the surface, it looked as clear as yesterday, but on the inside, the temperature was extremely high. It was scorching hot, and the fire in his chest could burn everything around him at any time. Zhong Huiyan didn't see the note, but she could feel the change in the mood of the man beside her, especially the sense of danger. So she didn't ask, but obediently followed his footsteps, walking quickly on the streets of the slums. When they arrived at the Great Master Fan Mansion, Sulu took her in and handed her over to the Great Master. He didn't explain anything, just whispered a few words to her, then turned around and left. He believed that even if someone was following him, they wouldn't have the ability to break into the White Courtyard and cause trouble. The next thing he had to do was to get rid of those who might be hiding in the shadow of the locust tree. Those who disguised themselves as street vendors, or beggars who were street vendors in the first place, had to get rid of them. Although he wasn't Chao Chodao or Shi Qinghai, it wasn't difficult to get rid of those who were following him. Because of his rich experience, the people he learned from in the past were too fierce. Whether it was the Empire or the Federation, whether it was the Imperial Intelligence Agency or the secret department called Small Eyes, they could only watch as he turned into a ghost in the night and disappeared mysteriously, let alone these guys. Sulu, wearing a casual hat that covered most of his face, walked back and forth through the busiest streets of the slums 3 times. After circling under the locust tree and willow tree, he was sure that no one could follow him. He silently left the smelly streets, followed a diagonal path into the lakeside park in the distance, and walked along the willow embankment towards the imposing imperial palace. He didn't walk into the palace when he was close to the black and blue palace wall. Instead, he walked along the wall to the west, passed through the spacious square, stepped on the automatic path, and slowly sank into the underground passage. The buildings near the square gave off an air of sternness and indifference, because these buildings belonged to the Imperial Military Newspaper, the Special Operations Department, the Ministry of Finance, and other important departments. Probably because of the pervasive sense of oppression in the air, there were very few pedestrians in the square and underground passageways. There were not even many nobles, and most of them were soldiers in dark imperial military uniforms, walking with stern expressions. Sulu, who was wearing ordinary civilian clothes and had a hat covering his face, was naturally very eye-catching among these soldiers. Dozens of vigilant and suspicious gazes fell on him, but he seemed to be unaware of them as he slightly lowered his head. He silently looked at the constantly moving road under his feet, thinking about what he thought was important. He wasn't sure who the idiots were, but he was sure that some of the idiots were trying to threaten him by kidnapping Aunt Susan. They wanted to get some benefits from him. The question was, what exactly did those people want to obtain? Philip's secret or the secret of the star chart? If it was those people he suspected, with their ability, it was impossible for them to obtain this information, then what did they want to do? Well, there was no need to think about this question anymore, Sulu said to himself. Then he slowly raised his head and looked at the Imperial Military Headquarters building across the underground passage that was full of murderous aura. He silently thought, what I need to think about now is how to kill those idiots and bring Aunt Susan back to the small courtyard. Behind the solemn Imperial Military Headquarters building, there was a very inconspicuous, gray and plain building hidden behind a few rows of gloomy trees. The shape of this building was square, and from the outside, one could not find the slightest trace of an arc. Because of its age, it looked like an iron box that had been buried in the desert for hundreds of years. Although it was modeled, it was exceptionally stiff. This was the most gloomy agency of the Empire, the Intelligence Department, and also Su Li's destination. At the entrance of the Intelligence Department building, he was not surprised to be stopped. A certain staff member, who was wearing a black uniform and looked like a murderous demon on a rainy night, stared at the guy who looked like a tourist with deathly white eyes and asked gloomily, "What do you want to do?" Sulu didn't have time to explain anything. He took out the identity chip that Hui Chaoshi gave to him on the Liban star and handed it over. The staff member frowned and picked up the scanning stick to scan it. He casually glanced at the display on the light screen, and his face suddenly changed dramatically. Because of the sharp contraction of his pupils, the color of death quickly occupied a larger part of his eyeballs. "Sir! Sir! Sir!" The staff member bowed with a trembling voice, guessing the identity of Sulu, wondering if he should kneel down to show respect. Sulu didn't have the time or interest to enjoy this kind of pleasure. Expressionlessly, he walked into the gloomy building. The staff member hurriedly dialed the number of his superior, then quickly ran behind him and followed him step by step. His voice was still trembling. "Sir. Sir, on behalf of all the staff of the Intelligence Department, I warmly welcome your inspection. Director Cisco is rushing down, but I'm very sorry, the 3 deputy directors are not in the department today. Deputy Director Bim is assisting His Highness in the battle on Imo-Hua planet. Deputy Director Kempade is handling the military supply in L9, and Deputy Director Yaki is on the orders of His Majesty to investigate a murder case in the Archdiocese." After confirming the terrifying authority of the other party and guessing that the other party was secretly working in the Intelligence Department, this staff member of the Intelligence Department told him everything he knew. In just a short distance of a dozen meters, he clearly explained the current personnel situation in the department. When they reached the stairs, Colonel Cisco, the director of the Intelligence Department's General Affairs Department, rushed down, sweating profusely. Behind him were 2 directors. When the 3 directors saw Sulu, their gazes subconsciously swept past his hair and eyes, revealing a hint of hesitation, but they immediately hid it. With unusual respect, they stood at attention and saluted, saying respectfully, "It's a great honor to have you here to inspect our work." As the highest-ranking officials of the Imperial Intelligence Department, they had the right to access some secret files and could directly receive the orders of His Highness. Therefore, they could vaguely guess the identity of this ordinary-looking young man. However, since it involved the secrets of the royal family, no one dared to mention it. They just tried their best to stand as straight as possible, pressing their palms and thighs together a little tighter, and their attitudes a little more serious. "Keep my arrival a secret." Sulu looked at these officers of the Intelligence Department and said, "Give me a room with a good workbench. This way, please." Walking into the room, Sulu extended his finger and adjusted the metal piece in his ear. After a brief pause, he immediately said, "Bring up the data on all the resistance organizations." The workbench made a light beep, and a pleasing stream of data began to flow on the thin screen. Sulu quietly watched for a few seconds, and after confirming that the computing core was quite fast, he nodded in satisfaction. None of the officers of the Intelligence Department present dared to ignore his request. Director Cisco quickly rushed out of the door, and just as he was about to call for his subordinates to prepare the relevant data, he suddenly thought of something and turned to Sulu. Wiping the cold sweat on his forehead, he said in a trembling voice, "My lord, in the past 10 years, a total of 3,412 rebel organizations have appeared in the Empire. Although the data index is complete, the database is simply too large. Which star field would you like to see the data from first?" Sulu was stunned. Although he had wandered the star field of the Empire for more than 2 years and had seen many bitter struggles, he still did not expect that the class conflict in the Empire had intensified to such an extent that so many rebel organizations had appeared in just 10 years. The biggest one. He gave a very clear direction, and after a brief pause, he narrowed his eyes and said, "Chi Daebing's one." The underground resistance organizations in the Empire were officially recognized as rebel organizations. There were countless of them, and they had all kinds of strange names, such as the Li Band Youth Army, the Mushi Land Cleaners Movement, and the Tsangsong National Salvation Group. In the past few decades, there was only one organization called the Underground Resistance Organization, and everyone knew what this organization was. The reason why there was no need for a prefix was because this underground resistance organization was the biggest, most powerful, and most fiercely competitive with the Empire's royal family. Under the leadership of Old Voss and the hidden influence of that guy, this organization lurked at the bottom of the empire and gradually grew, leading thousands of poor people and slaves at the bottom of the empire to launch one riot after another. A few years ago, after being brutally suppressed by the butcher King Cardin, and then being cruelly harvested by the empire's military, the underground resistance organization suffered a great loss in strength. Following the invasion of the federal forces, this organization and the Federation secretly reached some kind of agreement, but the Empire's propaganda agency publicized it, forcing them to become somewhat silent. The Information Bureau used the fastest speed to input a huge amount of information about the underground resistance organization into the workbench in front of Su Lu. Su Lu immediately made a second request, requesting that the Information Bureau fully open the access to the workbench's database and use a high-power wave tracking signal to continuously transmit to a certain space outside of Tianjing's atmosphere. This is the space coordinate. Director Sisko continued to wipe the sweat on his forehead that had not stopped, and answered with great pain, "Sir, although you have extremely high access, the Information Bureau's database cannot be opened like this, especially since the fixed-point wave tracking signal transmission is too unsafe. It is very likely that a dangerous situation of signal leakage will occur. Right now, I really need this data to find a person." Su Lu looked at him and said, "I know that there are people in the Information Bureau keeping an eye on that small courtyard, but in the end, this incident still happened, so I don't trust your abilities. I can only find him myself." The mistrust of an officer was the greatest humiliation to a subordinate, especially as the most professional officers in the Information Bureau. Hearing Su Li's words, the three directors started to wipe their sweat at the same time, but still, no one dared to do as he requested. Opening access to the Information Bureau's database was too dangerous. Su Lu was silent for a moment, then said, "Ask the palace, just say that I owe him one." 20 minutes later, Su Lu silently left the gray building of the Information Bureau. Having made all the preparations, he came to the agreed location on the piece of paper. Narrowing his eyes, he looked at the dilapidated garage that was filled with the smell of engine oil. It was as if he had returned to the garage of the past, except that Muan was no longer here, and the seriously ill leader Voss had long left. Chapter 873. Squinting his eyes at the graffiti-covered iron gate, Su Lu raised his left hand and touched his ear. This small action did not have any symbolic meaning, but it was a little itchy from the sound in his ear. In the noisy street, in the relatively quiet and deep auto repair factory, Philip's calm voice kept coming from the ultra-thin metal piece in his ear. The tri-winged spaceship was tens of thousands of kilometers away, but the sound was enough to be heard clearly. After obtaining the data of the Imperial Intelligence Agency, Philip began to search for the possible strongholds of the underground resistance, looking for the follow-up of the kidnappers of Aunt Susan from the surveillance video. But until now, there were no concrete findings. Su Lu had no choice but to keep the appointment. Philip, on the other hand, activated another part of the computing core. Using the authority he had just obtained, he directly remotely controlled several high-sensitivity military satellites outside of Tianjing planet's atmosphere and stared at this street. After leaving the Federation, Su Lu removed the chip from his neck and did not install it again. His communication with Philip changed to direct voice communication. Although there was no precise data grid in his left eye, he was already used to this method and did not want to change. Philip monitored that there were about 30 armed soldiers in the auto repair factory. In addition to a large number of semi-automatic rifles, there should be a few boxes of high-powered weapons hidden under the roof of the roof. Su Lu slowly raised his head and squinted at the worn-out corner of the roof of the third floor, guessing in his heart how the other side would deal with him. Do we need to inform the Imperial Intelligence Agency about this stronghold? Philip asked, or rather, he gave his own suggestion. In his opinion, with the support of his data, the Imperial Intelligence Agency could easily destroy this auto repair factory. Su Lu shook his head. Before Philip found Aunt Susan, any action should be cautious. And because of some of the past experiences and kindness, although he was angry at this time, it was difficult for him to make the decision to directly help the Imperial Intelligence Agency to deal with the resistance. The iron gate that was only opened a crack slowly opened, and a faint smell of engine oil appeared in front of Su Lo along with a mechanic covered in grease. Today, Chi Dabing was wearing a gray auto mechanic uniform, but he was still as cold and proud as when he wore the Empire's military uniform. He looked down at him condescendingly and said coldly, "You finally appeared." Su Lo frowned slightly as he looked back at him. This fellow did not have the self-awareness to work underground at all. His domineering aura was simply courting death. However, Su Lo had to admit that this expert, who had once fought to the death with him in the underground sewers and had even left a mecha for him outside Master Fan's manor, seemed to have matured a little after these few years. Although his gaze was still sharp, there was more or less the air of a leader. Why? He didn't beat around the bush and asked directly. "If I don't use this method, will you appear? It has already been a week since you arrived on Tianjing planet, yet you have never thought of taking the initiative to contact us." Chi Dabing's expression was cold. With a trace of disdain, he said, "You are a coward. You only know how to escape. Where did your so-called bravery and justice go? Do you still remember what you promised us in front of that old man in a wheelchair in that auto repair factory a few years ago? What do you owe us?" Su Lo was silent. He thought of Leader Voss in a wheelchair that year. He thought of that rather pleasant conversation. He thought of those resistance fighters who had died beside him when he was escaping from Tianjing planet. He forcefully suppressed the gloominess in his heart and asked softly, "Tell me your demands. What will it take for you to let him go?" Chi Dabing didn't answer this question. He lowered his gaze and stared at his wrists. Suddenly, he frowned and asked, "What about that watch?" "I threw it away," Su Lo replied. "Threw it away?" Chi Dabing's brows slowly furrowed. He asked with an oppressive aura, "That was the only memento that teacher left for me. You shamelessly snatched it away, and you actually threw it away just like that?" Su Lo extended an index finger, looked at him, and replied, "You have to understand one thing. That is my watch. I can do whatever I want with it." Chi Dabing was silent for a moment and didn't say anything else. He raised his right arm and gestured for him to enter. He said coldly, "Someone will answer your questions later." Su Lo saw the cold killing intent in his eyes. He was naturally not afraid, but he was a little cold that the other party didn't hide it at all. It was just like the contempt and ridicule from before. "I thought you were already the leader of the organization. It seems like you haven't been doing well these few years." Since the other party didn't hide his hostility or even his killing intent, Su Lo naturally didn't mind reviving the harshness of his youth and using words to make the other party unhappy. Walking from the auto repair factory into the building, Su Lo saw a lot of young and old repair workers along the way. He didn't know if they were wearing bulletproof vests under their oily overalls. He didn't know if they had calluses on their hands from repairing cars or pulling triggers. These resistance fighters still retained their former special colors. Regardless of age, they all looked extremely strong. Their stiff faces and calm eyes revealed different emotions. They watched Su Lo walk in front of them. Some showed vigilance, some spat to show disdain, and some smiled and even waved to him. Although his heart was filled with worry for Aunt Susan and some kind of anger that was about to erupt from the volcano, Su Li's mood gradually calmed down when he saw the resistance fighters smiling and greeting him. He nodded and greeted these old friends who had fought side by side with him in the rain. "Welcome." In the innermost room on the second floor, there were 5 people sitting. After Chi Dabing brought Su Lo through the door, under the leadership of an old man, everyone stood up at the same time to welcome him. The old man's attitude was gentle and warm. He opened his arms as if he wanted to give Sulu a hug. Sulu stood in place and didn't go forward to hug the old man. After slightly bowing his head to show respect, he directly said, "I don't think this is a good way to welcome you. And I can't believe that the resistance group after Leader Voss would be so shameless as to kidnap an innocent woman at the bottom of the hierarchy." A trace of embarrassment flashed across the old man's wrinkled face. He apologized in an extremely sincere tone. "Please allow me to apologize to you on behalf of the organization. In fact, this action didn't get the consent of most of the committee members. But since it has become an established fact, we have to bear the consequences of this immoral action together. In fact, we understand your current difficult situation very well. We thought that it would be difficult for you to make the decision to contact us, so we were forced to use this method. I hope you can understand after hearing our explanation." Hearing this, Chi Dabing raised his eyebrows slightly. He immediately returned to his indifference and sat down next to the old man. Sulu roughly confirmed some things. After a moment of silent consideration, he sat down under the old man's warm invitation. His hand didn't hold the cup of hot tea in front of him. Instead, it was slightly hanging by his side, ready to attack at any time. He said, "When will you release her?" "Immediately." The old man looked at him with a smile and said, "Please don't worry. That Madame Susan is very safe now. Her health is guaranteed." Sulu raised his head, stared into the old man's eyes, and said, "An ordinary woman who sells pirated music players in the market was kidnapped by a powerful underground resistance group when she was sick. She didn't know where she was or if she would die. She would be scared and fearful. Do you think this is the so-called safety? Or do you think that having a bowl of rice and not being tortured is healthy?" The expressions of the people in the room were a little awkward. Only Chi Dabing was still indifferent and calm, as if he didn't feel Su Li's sharp gaze that was like nails hammering into his face. "Before we talk, I want to introduce the current situation of the group to you. Leader Voss passed away, and the resistance movement in various areas has suffered an unprecedented blow. Now, the Committee of Seven is temporarily in charge of the work arrangements of the entire group." The old man said with a pained expression, "But as you can see, there are only 6 people in this room now, because Muan betrayed us 3 years ago." Su Lo frowned slightly. The highest level of the underground resistance group, the Committee of Seven. If that was the case, Chi Dabing really didn't become the second Leader Voss. But why would these big shots of the resistance group take such a great risk to gather in one place and use such a method to force him to meet? What was even more strange was why this old man wanted to report the situation of the upper echelons of the resistance group to him. Just like most of the time in the past few years, he didn't have the time, energy, and interest to guess the other party's thoughts. He asked directly, "Why do you want to see me? What do you want?" "We want to continue the agreement we made years ago with you," the old man looked at him and said calmly. Su frowned slightly and thought of the agreement he made with the wheelchair-bound Leader Voss back then. He smiled bitterly and replied, "You should know very well that I'm no longer some Federation hero, and I'm also not the successor of war god Li Pifu. I don't want to interfere in the cooperation between you and the Federation, and I can't interfere. Of course we know this very well. We even know that you are the only flesh and blood of His Majesty in this universe, but we still insist on the agreement we made years ago." The old man looked at him with a complicated expression. After a long silence, he said, "We all believe in Leader Voss's judgment. He won't be wrong about you. You are a kind person. You can easily become the king of the Left Sky Star region, but according to our intelligence, you have already rejected His Majesty's proposal to invite you into the palace. This fact is verified with some of our whimsical thoughts. It can only be said that this is fate's arrangement." Su Lu had a beast-like ability to read people that Feng Yu praised so much. All these years, he had only seen Pabre once. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the old man. He could see the sincerity and no malice in the other party, but he still couldn't understand. What do you want to say? We want to invite you to lead the entire underground resistance group. The old man looked at him with a serious expression and said sincerely, we want to invite you to be the emperor. Chapter 874. Hearing this, Sulo was stunned and speechless. Staring at the leaders of the resistance organizations in the room, he subconsciously frowned and slowly loosened his fingers. He didn't understand why these people kidnapped Aunt Susan and forced him to walk into the trap at the risk of being discovered by the Imperium, at the risk of being caught by the Imperium, at the risk of being enraged, and at the risk of infuriating him. It was actually because of this reason. After seeing that note, in the small courtyard, in the alley, and outside the building of the Intelligence Bureau, he had thought of many answers. This speculation continued until he walked into the auto repair shop and met these people. He thought that the other party might have found out about Philip's existence through some means and knew about the existence of the spaceship, and wanted to obtain some cutting-edge technological achievements from him. He thought that the other party might have set up an extremely terrifying encirclement, and wanted to kill him at all costs, so as to make the Emperor extinct. He even thought that the other party might use Aunt Susan's life to threaten him into entering the palace to assassinate the Emperor, but he never thought they wanted him to be the Emperor of the Empire. Sulu said that he needed to calm down for a while to digest this shock. The old man smiled and waved his hand to signal the other committee members in the room to leave, but he stayed behind. He politely and even somewhat humbly replaced the undrunk tea in Su Li's cup with a hot one. Almost at the same time, Sulu heard Philip's voice in his ears. The resistance fighters who had been lying in ambush in the corridor had quietly retreated. He frowned and slowly raised his head, looking at the old man who was moving slowly. He felt the other party's sincerity and thus found the other party's proposal extremely absurd. Let me introduce myself first. My name is Tang Jizhong. The old man looked at him with a smile and said, I can understand the shock in your heart right now. When the committee's proposal was just in its embryonic form, it was greatly criticized. In the eyes of many people, suggesting and using all the power of the organization to help you become the Emperor of the Left Sky Star region is a muddled and absurd crazy idea. Sulu tilted his head and looked at him silently, thinking, is this matter not crazy? But I persisted, and I was lucky enough to convince most of my comrades that this crazy idea was possible. For the people of the Left Sky Star region, this was the best choice they could make. Sulu was silent for a moment before he shook his head and asked, in my impression, the ultimate political agenda of the resistance organization is to overthrow the reign of the royal family, return the power to the people, and realize democracy and equality in the left heaven space zone. If that's the case, why are you helping me to become an emperor? The important thing is not me, but the position of emperor. Elder Tang Jizhong looked at him gently and said, let me explain it to you. After the bloody massacre of the royal family, the most determined and brave rebels shed too much blood. The organization can't bear to see more soldiers become lonely ghosts under the butcher's knife for the sake of ambitious goals. We want to find a relatively gentle revolutionary path. More importantly, we have to admit that after Wai Fu Chai's bloody purge, the people at the bottom who survived have lost the courage to resist. They are cowardly and foolishly cheering for the rule of the royal family and the victory at the front line. This is related to the glorious brainwashing of the royal family, as well as the improvement measures of Wai Fu Chai in the last few decades. Our emperor is holding the butcher's knife in one hand and the beautiful picture of the educational reform and gradual abolition of slavery in the other. He has successfully maintained the hopes of the majority of the people of the empire for the royal family. Especially in the situation where the federal forces invaded, the blind loyalty of the lower class of the empire is getting stronger and stronger. The organization has already lost the foundation to launch another great rebellion. Blind loyalty. Su Lu repeated this somewhat unfamiliar word in a low voice. The people of the empire are already used to the lofty position of the royal family and the nobles. If no one bullies them, they will instead be very unaccustomed to it, and even feel afraid. Therefore, when someone tries to wake them up and overthrow the masters who ride on their backs, they will be hurt by them instead. The corners of Tang Zhizhong's lips curled up slightly into a faint and sorrowful smile. Do you feel that this is very inconceivable? Su Lu replied, I have been to many places in the empire in the past 2 years and have also seen many bullied and humiliated people numbly accept the exploitation from the nobles. Sometimes, they would even take the initiative to defend the nobles in some systems that, in my opinion, are very problematic. He raised his head to look at the old man and said, You know that I grew up in the Federation. I truly cannot understand what I have seen and what you have said before. Tang Zhizhong shook his head and sighed. But this is the current situation of the empire. Although the blankets on the people are very heavy, so heavy that it is painful and can even suffocate them, their most intuitive feeling is that the blankets are warm in the end. Who would be willing to have their blankets taken away from them and stand naked in the night wind, needing to search everywhere for firewood to warm themselves? But, what does this have to do with me? Su Lu asked. The history of civilization in the empire is not entirely made up of blood and slaughter. Sometimes, there are also many shining points full of wisdom. For example, more than 3,000 years ago, there was once a political school on planet Yellow Disaster. They once wanted to establish an experimental system, but unfortunately, the royal family at that time did not give them the opportunity and responded mercilessly with bullets. What is that? The false monarch republic. Su Lu once again heard a political term that he had never heard of before. Although he had been crazily reading books on politics and humanities in the past 2 years, he still had to admit that he was only a hair's breadth away from being an idiot in this regard. So, he could only listen silently. Tang Zhizhong looked at him and gently explained, the false monarch republic can actually be understood as a kind of dual power system. The empire still has an emperor who is still hereditary and has the right to appoint the cabinet. The legislative and supervisory power is exercised by the parliament, and the parliament is elected by the people regardless of race or class. However, the emperor has the right to veto. After giving a very brief explanation, the old man took out an electronic document from the drawer and slowly pushed it across the table to Su Lu. He said, this experimental political design of the predecessors and many key points of checks and balances are basically recorded here. When you have time, you can take a look. Su Li's fingertips lightly slid across the electronic document. Looking at the complicated clauses, he frowned slightly and directly asked the most important question, whose orders does the military obey? The military is strictly prohibited from interfering in internal affairs. The right to declare war is given to His Majesty by the Parliament. Who are the powerful organizations in the empire accountable to? For example, the police. Su Lu looked up at the old man and asked, if the cabinet is appointed by the emperor, then he naturally has the most powerful armed forces in the empire. How does the parliament keep him in check? There is relevant content in this document, Tang Zhizhong said. While you are reading, I would like to explain to you why I insist that the false monarch republic is very suitable for the current empire. Keeping the monarchy, keeping the dignity and glory of the emperor, will make it easier for the nobles and the people who are loyal to the royal family to accept it. It will unite the people to the greatest extent so that the empire will not fall apart because of the turmoil of the regime change and become a dish for the people of the Federation. As for the parliament that has the legislative power, whether or not it will be full of nobles, slave merchants who bribed people, or the most shameless political opportunists in the first few decades, as long as these people have power and are used to the wonderful taste of confrontation with the emperor, it will be difficult for them to get rid of it. They will do everything they can to protect the system, even if it is at the cost of their reputation and lives. After developing in this way for several decades, a whole generation of young, intelligent, and courageous people who are good at fighting for political rights will appear in the Empire's society. With the injection of this new blood, the false monarch republic will gradually become a reality until true democracy is finally realized. Su Lu listened to the old man's overly simple and fairy tale-like deduction. She quickly flipped through the information in her hands. Her brows furrowed tighter and tighter. She said, according to the design in the information, the Emperor of the Empire will simply become a sacred symbol without any actual power. Tang Zhizhong smiled and said, keeping the Emperor's throne is based on respect for history and the feelings of the people of the Empire over the countless years. Since the symbol is sacred, it will also receive the respect of the people. Su Luk shook his head and said, no emperor will be willing to give up his power. Although this set of political design is beautiful, there is no practical meaning. In the end, it will still depend on war and bloodshed. There is an emperor who will be willing. Tang Zhizhong looked at him quietly and said slowly, let's go back to what we were talking about earlier. If you were to become the emperor, would you order the Iron Blood Army to return to Tianjing planet and massacre the parliament because of your greed for the power in your hands? Su Lu remained silent and did not reply. You are the first person in history who has not received any education in the Empire and is naturally resistant to exploiting and suppressing the people at the lower levels. Compared to the dark and decadent Bai Jinhui clan, you are a blank piece of paper. You can draw the most beautiful picture for the Empire as you wish. The wrinkles on Tang Zhizhong's face gradually smoothed out, but his voice became more and more impassioned. There was an irrepressible joy in his hot-bloodedness. He looked at Su Lu and said seriously, the document in front of you is a great opportunity that fate has bestowed upon the people of the Empire. It is a great change that has never happened in the Left Sky Star region for countless tens of thousands of years. As long as you agree, we will help you return to the palace at all costs and even the lives of all of us to become the next emperor of the Empire. We only hope that in the future, you will remember the reason why we sacrificed our lives. The quiet room sank into a long silence. Tang Zhizhong looked at Su Lu quietly, waiting for his reply. Chapter 875. In these 2 years under the company of sunshine and rain, Su Lu had read many books related to the history of the Empire. He was often stimulated by the smell of blood and conspiracy behind those simple sentences. In the long years of the Left Sky Galaxy, who knew how many families and geniuses had sacrificed their lives to the abyss for the title of emperor? However, only a few lucky people could achieve what they wanted. The path to the Dragon Throne was brilliant and full of thorns that pierced through iron shoes and luxurious clothes, leaving mottled bloodstains. Without a doubt, it was the most difficult path to walk in the world. However, this saying was not suitable for the current empire and him. As the only direct male descendant of the Hui family in Baiyan, this was his biggest advantage. He did not need to care about how the emperor viewed him, his own son. He did not need to be vigilant, shameless, or cold. He did not need to play the role of a repentant and obedient crown prince. He did not need to wear a hypocritical mask made of gold. He did not need to do anything and could easily return to the black and green imperial palace. Under the name of the Crown Prince, he secretly controlled the network and military force of the resistance organization and silently waited for the emperor to grow old and die. Then, he would become the new emperor, the only master of the billions of people in the Left Sky Galaxy. If the royal family wanted to give Su Lu some kind of test, if Wei Fuqi needed some deeds to convince those unwilling distant relatives, then the credit of destroying the largest resistance organization in the empire would have fallen into his hands many years in advance with Elder Tang Zhizhong's indifferent words. At that time, she, the only one who had the qualifications and ability to stop all of this from happening, would definitely remain silent. She would even indifferently control that terrifying peach miasma mecha and rampage through the left sky galaxy, taking down all the royal family nobles who dared to question this decision. This powerful princess, when she just found out about Su Li's identity, did not hesitate to take the risk and brazenly charge into the Federation. In front of the blood relationship between siblings, the position of emperor was not worth mentioning. As for the White Courtyard, which was hidden behind Bai Yan's Huai's dynasty and appeared to be even more mysterious and powerful than the 7 great families of the Federation, it would probably be very happy to see Su Lo become the ruler of this star region. Apart from their relationship, it was also related to Master Fan's passion for love and peace. Su Lo sat at the table in silence. His hands, which were hanging by his sides, had already been placed on the table in advance. He subconsciously held the teacup. His brows furrowed tighter and tighter, and his eyes narrowed more and more perplexed. In a very short time, he used the mechanical logic of an engineer to deduce the other party's proposal and came to this conclusion. Just as Elder Tang Zhizhong had said, as long as he agreed to their request and fulfilled today's agreement in the future, he would become the most famous monarch in history books. The Left Heaven Starfield was like a class society that had been frozen for tens of thousands of years, ushering in a brand new era. This drama that no one could predict was about to unfold. However, a new era only meant change. No one knew if it was the best or the worst era. Furthermore, this change was so intense and had such far-reaching effects. Su Lo couldn't help but sink into anxious and muddle-headed contemplation. He didn't know how to answer or how to choose, so he could only remain silent. Elder Tang Zhizhong could feel his intense mental struggle, so he just waited quietly. He believed that the dead Voss and himself wouldn't misjudge the young man across the table. He believed that no matter how long he waited, there would eventually be a result, and it would be a very good one. The confrontation between the silence and waiting was forcefully interrupted by a sudden noise. As the wall creaked, the tightly locked door was violently pushed open. Qi Dabing walked to Su Li's side with an ashen face. He looked at Elder Tang Zhizhong across the table and said in a deep voice, "We are all willing to sacrifice for our great ideals, but have you ever thought about why this person deserves our trust?" Tang Zhizhong furrowed his brows and said, "Trust is something that can't be proven. I believe in your teacher, Voss, and my own judgment. Just because of this inexplicable trust, you want the entire organization, hundreds of thousands of brave warriors, to risk their lives for this person. Don't forget, he is the son of that tyrant Huai Fu Chai. Although he grew up in the Federation, the filthy blood of the Huai family still flows in his veins." The veins on Qi Dabing's neck popped out. He waved his arms and asked angrily, "Even if he is worthy of our trust now, what will happen after we push him onto the throne? 3 years ago, you told all the comrades that position can change people, and unrestricted power can corrupt the noblest sentiments of humans. Therefore, you objected to me taking over the position of the leader of the organization, and instead created this so-called Committee of 7. Fine. I believed that you were doing it for the sake of justice, so I accepted the decision of the organization. Then what about now? Why do you believe that the position won't change this guy after he becomes the emperor of the empire? Why do you believe that the unrestricted power of the emperor won't corrupt him? There are many comrades like me who are willing to sacrifice, but we are not willing to make such meaningless sacrifices." Qi Dabing took a deep breath and said in a deep voice, "If he becomes the emperor of the empire, but is not willing to carry out today's agreement and hand over the power in his hands, then what will the organization, which has already lost its power, use to pursue the matter? Or is it that we can only scold him a little?" Elder Tang Zhizhong's mood turned gloomy. He looked coldly at Qi Dabing and said, "This is the decision that the majority of the committee members agreed to, and I insist on it." "No." Qi Dabing raised his chin slightly and said firmly, "Unless he does something to prove that he is not the same as those detestable members of the royal family." He lowered his head to look at Su Lo and said coldly, because Muan has always been closely protected by the intelligence agency of the Empire, we have never been able to kill him. If you want us to believe you, you have to bring his head to me within a month. With your current identity, it shouldn't be difficult for you to accomplish this. Su Lo raised his head and looked at Chi Dabing's slightly twisted face. His mind, which was originally in a confused and anxious state, suddenly calmed down. After a moment of silence, he said, as far as I know, although Muan left the resistance organization, he didn't do anything for the intelligence agency except for the visit to the Federation 3 years ago. He didn't betray any of you. After a slight pause, he continued, putting aside the standpoint, Muan can be considered my friend. He saved me back then, so I can't do this request of yours. Chi Dabing didn't seem to be surprised by his answer. He looked at him and said in a deep voice, I don't care about your words of defending that shameful traitor. Since you don't want to kill him, then I suggest you the second way to prove yourself, to kill Hui Chaoshi. Su Lo frowned and looked at him for a long time. He asked, is there something wrong with your brain? I know she is your sister, Chi Dabing said angrily. Chi Dabing said angrily, but don't forget that the blood of countless of our comrades is flowing in the hands of this princess. In the face of justice, things like family and bloodline must be forgotten and abandoned, not to mention that this is a sinful, dirty, rotten, and backward family bloodline. Su Li's thick eyebrows furrowed even more sharply. He looked at him in silence. If you don't understand this point, it proves that you don't have a firm revolutionary ideology at all. I can't just watch you take control of the organization. I will do everything in my power to stop you. Hearing these strange and oppressive declarations, Su Li's tightly furrowed brows gradually relaxed. It wasn't because he understood something, but because he remembered something. The girl on the Iron Tower in Linhai, those young students full of revolutionary optimism, he calmly recalled, and then he confirmed some things. In terms of emotions, I've always been leaning towards you, until this moment. It's because I can't accept that an organization waving the flag of idealism would actually use this kind of robber gang method. Is this a kidnapping between two murderers? The sharp light in Chi Dabing's eyes gradually calmed down. With his hands behind his back, he looked down at Su Lo. After a moment of silence, he didn't say anything and turned to leave. I'm sorry, if thinking is something that can be easily changed, then you don't need to think for so long before. It's obvious that some comrades in our organization haven't changed their thinking. Elder Tang Zhizhong sighed, stood up and said to Su Lo. However, he felt a little strange in his heart because Chi Dabing's performance of rushing into the room was obviously meaningless. It seemed that he only wanted to provoke Su Lo so that he wouldn't accept this agreement. I'm sorry. Su Lo looked at the elder and said. Elder Tang Zhizhong's expression slightly froze. He immediately smiled and raised his hand to stop the latter half of his words. He sincerely said, please don't make a hasty decision because of a moment of emotional fluctuation. I think you need to sit alone and think about it. After saying this, the elder slowly walked out of the room with a hunched body. When the door closed, Su Lo suddenly felt that the elder's figure was extremely tired. It was very similar to some of the figures he had seen in his life, such as the leader in a wheelchair, or the director of the department of Zhou who stayed up all night to work, or the old man in the hospital bed by Lake Feiqing. Probably because of the déjà vu, Su Lo didn't have the heart to say his decision immediately. Instead, he listened to the elder's request and sat alone in the room to think, or to prepare for his next move. A few minutes later, Philip's voice sounded in Su Li's ears. The expression on his face suddenly changed. He suddenly turned around and looked at the closed door. His slightly narrowed eyes were full of shock. The door was pushed open again, but this time it was much gentler and more polite. The person who walked into the room was still Chi Dabing. He used a white hot towel to carefully wipe his slender fingers. He walked straight to the old man's seat and slowly sat down. He raised his head and calmly looked at Su Lo. The previous appearance of an excited and angry revolutionary leader in the prime of his life had long disappeared. At this time, his face was full of confidence and steadiness based on strength, as well as a palpitating calmness. I think now the two of us can talk about future arrangements. Chapter 876. Chi Dabing looked at him and smiled. He gently placed the steaming handkerchief on the table and said calmly, "Since you don't want to go back to the Imperial Palace, then don't go back. Since you don't like the Empire, then don't stay in the Left Sky Star region. Although you can't go back to the Federation, I think Bermuda is still a good place to go. I believe that with your ability, you will have a great time in that paradise of adventurers." Of course. The smile on his face gradually disappeared. He said seriously, "The organization will definitely launch a continuous hunt for you. But to be honest, people like you and me won't be killed so easily. Besides, you have the help of that princess." Su Lo listened quietly. He narrowed his eyes and looked at him. Suddenly, he said, "You killed him." Chi Dabing's expression froze slightly. Then, he said calmly, "A revolution has always been a life and death movement. It is a storm, not a light breeze or drizzle. A revolution is a baptism, a revolution is an evolution. It is when the old is gone and the new is positive. It is when the sacrifice of a few people is used to advance the general trend. You talk a lot of nonsense." Su Lo looked at him quietly. "I gave him a chance. Just now, I rushed in so recklessly and angrily and questioned him. What was his reaction? He didn't react at all. He didn't change this absurd idea. He still wants to push you onto the throne." What made me feel even more disdainful was that he actually didn't get angry. He didn't reprimand me. Is he afraid of me? Or is he trying to maintain a calm appearance and launch a fierce counterattack against me later? Chi Dabing's eyebrows raised slightly. His usually sharp and cold eyes were full of contempt and mockery. He said, "It was his calmness that made me make up my mind. In order to express his damn sincerity to you, he drove away all the people in the corridor. Then, when he walked out of this room, his fate was already sealed. Your fate has already been decided. You will bear the crime of killing a senior leader of the organization." Su Lo slightly lowered his eyes, silently looking at the teacup in front of him and the cup of tea left by Tang Zhizhong on the opposite side of the table. Thinking of the old and tired figure before the door was closed, and thinking of the old man's body that was being dragged into the shadow somewhere in the corridor, he couldn't help but slowly frown. He understood that he was not mentally prepared at all, but had come into close contact with the resistance organization's cruel war for power, and witnessed a cold-blooded murder with his own eyes. "I didn't think you would do such a cruel thing, so I wasn't prepared." He raised his head and looked at Chi Dabing calmly, asking, "But why did you do this?" "Why?" Chi Dabing's voice was slightly higher, making it sound a bit shrill. After laughing for a long time, he said mockingly, "You can see this as a very simple political struggle. Right now, the organization needs a strong core leader, not like the past few years, where all the spirit of the organization is being worn down by the bullshit committee. This is completely different from the impression I had of you before." Su Lo looked into his eyes and said seriously, "Using a centralized method to fight against the centralized rule of the empire. Using lies to fight lies. I hate this method very much, and I believe you want more than this." Hearing this, Chi Dabing was silent for a long time, and somewhat irritably grabbed the wet towel and threw it to the corner of the table. He frowned and said, "Of course, I want more things. You probably don't remember, many people in the organization have deliberately forgotten this. He raised his head and looked at Sulu, laughed self-deprecatingly, and said, "My surname is also Huai. I am a marginal descendant of the Huai royal family in Baiyan." "So?" Sulu looked at this indifferent face and continued to ask. "The war on Mo Hua planet is very fierce. The whistling bullets do not have eyes that discriminate between classes. For them, there is no difference between the royal family and the slaves. In my opinion, the possibility of Huai Chaoshi dying in the hands of the federal army is very high. As long as this princess dies, that tyrant in the palace will have no more descendants. At that time, with the full support of the entire resistance organization, I will reveal my royal identity to the entire universe and contact the important officials of various departments through the spies hidden in the government. At that time, I will raise my arm, and no matter if it is the people at the bottom or the nobles, they will have no other choice but to elect me as the emperor." Qi Dabing described his plan with a cold expression. His eyes were indifferent, but some kind of invisible wildfire could be faintly seen burning in his eyes. "Back then, teacher nurtured me, and leader Voss valued me and chose me as his successor. This had a lot to do with my royal identity. I even thought that when I was young, they had arranged my life this way, and I was very willing to accept this arrangement." Qi Dabing's tone suddenly turned cold. He stared at Su Li's face and said gloomily, "However, back then, when you first appeared on Tianjing planet as a fugitive from the Federation and were imprisoned in Master Fan's manor, teacher, who rarely contacted me, actually did not hesitate to expose my identity to save you. Voss, that old fool, even placed the entire resistance organization's future on you. He did not hesitate to bear the crime of betraying the country just to cooperate with the Federation. Until now, you have actually become the Empire's only successor. Everything changed overnight. That dead old man and the stubborn political speculators in the committee all felt that their chance had come, and they chose you. Why? You asked me why, and I also want to ask you why. Why did you appear in front of me? If fate had chosen you, then what about me? Why do you also have such dirty blood flowing in your body? Why did you appear and take everything away from me when I had already accepted this arrangement of fate?" Qi Dabing suddenly stood up, and his sharp gaze pierced through the spreading wildfire. He stared at Su Li's face and roared angrily and coldly. "The Void Lord Republic wants someone to be the emperor. I should be the one to do it. My surname is also Huai." Su Li looked at him quietly as if he was looking at a lunatic. Then, he said, "You are a lunatic. You want to overthrow the emperor's rule, but in the end, you only want to be the emperor yourself. Then what about your revolutionary will? What about your baptism? What about your storm? What about your evolution? Why, is this not okay?" Qi Dabing looked at him mockingly and asked in return. After a moment of silence, Su Li said directly, "As long as I am alive, then of course not. For a person like you, even if you continue to live, I will feel disgusted when I think of looking up at the same starry sky as you, let alone being the emperor. You are indeed very righteous." Qi Dabing looked at him with a faint smile and said mockingly, "But what can you do? You don't dare to kill me. The more righteous you are, the less you dare to kill me. Whether that fat woman is worth you giving up the throne or not, in order to play the role of righteous you have always been, you can only do as I say." "Of course." He spread his hands and said coldly, "I am not stupid enough to use that fat woman's life to threaten you to commit suicide. I only ask that you leave and never talk about today's content." Su Li sat silently by the table. He had no intention of getting up, nor did he open his mouth to speak. Qi Dabing frowned slightly and pointed at the small window behind him that was about to welcome the setting sun. He said, "I will give you one last chance. Jump down from here and immediately leave the Empire. Then I will let her go." Su Li raised his head and squinted at his face. He said, I will give you one last chance. Immediately let her go, and then let the rest of the people in the building go. I will not participate in the internal struggle of your organization. Chi Dabing looked at him like he was an idiot. He said, you should understand one thing. Right now, only I have the right to threaten you. You don't have any means to threaten me. Su Li's shoulders sank slightly. The hand that had been holding the teacup slowly moved away from the table. Their palms were facing each other. He looked at him and said, I am threatening you with your own life. Then, I want to tell you something that very few people know. I have never been threatened by anyone since I was a child. Chi Dabing suddenly felt that the atmosphere in the quiet room had become somewhat heavy. It was clear that his most trusted subordinate had taken control of the entire floor, so no one should be able to disturb the negotiation here. He frowned and said, as long as a person is alive, they will inevitably be threatened, because they will always care about some people or things. But I have always refused to enter such a situation. Su Li replied, you don't know how hard my life has been. If I had to accept threats, I would have died countless times. My enemies in the Federation know this very well, so they have never dared to use my friends and family to threaten me. Once they fail, they will face a very terrifying me. His voice was very calm, as if he was narrating a very ordinary fact. Chi Dabing's gaze became extremely vigilant, because he heard some kind of unshakable will. A strong will came from a strong fact. Back in the Federation, Madame Macho in the back of the mountain had tried to use Su Li to threaten Su Li. Su Li had stepped on the snow in Charter Square for a night and used Madame Zhong to resolve the situation. Then, he had infiltrated S2 to kill Macklin, destroying the plan that Madame Tai had planned for a long time. During this process, he had never thought of accepting threats. After being threatened by those big shots once, his family, friends, and lovers would constantly be in danger because of him. Su Li absolutely could not accept this situation, so he used this method to express his attitude. Since then, all of his enemies, including President Pabre, had to think for a long time before making a move against people related to him, and they had to endure great psychological pressure. What you are doing today is actually something that Hui Chaoshi has done before. Back then, when she and I were imprisoned in Master Fan's manor, she tried to use Aunt Susan to threaten me to surrender, but I did not agree, and she did not dare to make any further attempts. Do you know why? Because I said something to her. Because I hate being forced to do certain things. If you force me into a corner, I will become a dog, a mad dog. Su Li stood up from the table, looked at Chi Dabing expressionlessly, and said, today, I will repeat to you one more time. If you dare to harm Aunt Susan, I will become a dog that salivates fiercely, stares at your calf, and will do anything to take a few bites. I will bite you until you are full of wounds, oozing pus, and your whole body rots to death. Chapter 877. Su Li stood up and continued to provoke Chi Dabing, who was sitting across the table, with his deliberately cold expression and crazy words. His calm gaze was like the surface of a lake that had not been blown by the wind, but it also showed signs that it could move at any time. When his gaze landed on Chi Dabing's coat, it was as if he could see the gun inside. The man across the table was very strong. Although Su Li had won twice in the underground sewer and in the auto repair factory, he would never underestimate this person. The royal blood in Chi Dabing's body was somewhat thin, but it was still enough to support him to cultivate 8 Raishinchi. What made Su Li even more vigilant was that he was another student of Feng Yu. If measured by data, this man should be the strongest man in the younger generation after the 3. How could he knock him down without alerting his subordinates outside the room? Su Li repeated Mad Dog's declaration in a cold tone, but his mind was doing fast calculations. He knew that he had to be fast. After calming down his opponent's mind, he would succeed in one strike. He was like a stray dog wandering by the side of a mine. When he saw food, he would rush up with ferocious determination and bite down hard, never letting go. When he just spat out the word "rot" from his thin lips, his hands calmly pressed on the table, his shoulders slightly lowered, and his body relaxed. When there was no sign that he was going to make a move, he suddenly made his move. The 5 fingers of his right hand suddenly spread open like the torn pages of a fan. With a whoosh, he grabbed the teacup in front of him. Chi Dabing seemed to be stunned by his fierce words, but in fact, he had been calmly watching all the subtle movements of his body, especially the teacup in front of him. So the moment Su Lu made a move, he made the fastest reaction. He didn't call for his subordinates outside the room in vain. Instead, he used his right hand as fast as lightning to pull out a pistol and aimed the black muzzle between Su Li's eyebrows. His index finger was on the trigger, and he didn't hesitate to press it down hard. He was very clear about Su Li's ability. He knew that once he made a move, it would be a matter of life and death. Therefore, his actions were very straightforward, without any hesitation. He didn't care about the consequences at all. He just wanted him to die. When the cold gun barrel was aimed at the space between Su Li's eyebrows and was about to shoot, Su Li's 5 fingers had just touched the edge of the teacup. His fingertips could only feel the coldness of the tea that penetrated the wall. It seemed that death was imminent. However, Su Lu never thought of using the teacup in front of him to buy time. His target was the teacup across the table, the one that also contained the cold tea that belonged to the dead Tang Zhizhong. An invisible force whizzed out from his fingertips and instantly broke through the distance between the table and accurately hit the small porcelain cup. Accompanied by a crisp sound, the teacup seemed to have received some kind of shock and jumped up in fear. It whistled through the air and viciously smashed into the black hole of the muzzle. Paw! With a dull and monotonous sound, the bullet shot out powerfully, but it was far away from the target. The tube-shaded green tree in the corner suddenly shattered. Chi Dabing's pupils shrank as he looked at the figure that swept across the table like a mad tiger and whizzed toward him. He made a calculation in his mind like lightning. He knew that if he tried to aim at the opponent again, the elbow strike that seemed to carry countless tons of weight would definitely smash his head into a rotten watermelon. He released his right hand that was tightly holding the gun and focused all his spiritual power on the left side of his body. In an instant, he bent his left arm and used his arm to protect his cheek. The tip of his elbow fiercely met the attack. The two people's elbows collided with each other without any fancy moves. The powerful force that was hidden between the bones and flesh took advantage of the momentum to burst out, causing the air to vibrate uneasily. However, Su Lu took advantage of the momentum to pounce on Chi Dabing fiercely with a 70% domineeringness. He actually smashed Chi Dabing into the wall and forced him to take 2 steps back. Without any pause, Su Li's left foot heavily stomped on the ground. His body leaned forward in an extremely aggressive manner, and his left arm unreasonably hit the opponent's neck, which was the weakest part of the opponent's body. The 2 movements were extremely simple, and there was no obvious distinction between the 2 movements. The 10 postures that he had learned since he was a child had long melted into his blood and nerves. In today's world, there were not many people who could be his opponent in close combat. Even someone as strong as Mad Manly had been defeated by him in terms of techniques when they were in Linyuan. If Chi Dabing's iron-like arm were to hit him, his neck bone would definitely crack. However, to Su Li's surprise, although Chi Dabing was pushed back in an extremely embarrassing manner, he did not know when, but his right arm was raised horizontally. In an almost impossible situation, he directly blocked Su Li's extremely domineering chop. The collision of the powerful forces once again shook the space. The leaves of the pipe-shade green tree that was in a state of collapse began to fall off the branches in the silent wind that suddenly appeared. Su Li's pupils shrank slightly. His opponent seemed to have guessed what his next move would be in advance. No, it should be said that Chi Dabing's body instinctively sensed what his next move would be. In an instant, he thought of a very important problem, and his mood suddenly became a little cold. His opponent was Feng Yu's student, so he must be very familiar with these sharp and terrifying close combat skills. He might even have practiced them for a longer time than him. Because of his cold mood, his fighting spirit increased. Su Lo expressionlessly crossed his legs and directly approached Chi Dabing. His 3 fingers formed a thorn, and with a strange twist, he went straight for his opponent's throat. Chi Dabing, who was very close to Chu Yunxing, narrowed his eyes. He raised his right knee to protect his lower abdomen, and his left palm turned into an iron door, blocking his throat. Like a blunt knife cutting into the old skin of a rhinoceros, or like a thick dictionary hitting a person, Su Li's fingers fiercely cut into Chi Dabing's palm, making a muffled sound. Purple blood seeped out from his palm, and his knuckles also became a little pale, and it was difficult for him to go any further. The battle continued. Elbow to elbow, knee to knee. In the extremely narrow space near the window, the 2 people were doing the sharpest and most ruthless close combat in the smallest area. The air was torn, rolled, and then torn again. Every part of their body became a terrifying weapon. No matter if it was the elbow, the knee, the snap of the fingers, or the head, they were all like steel and iron, piercing each other like needles. All of them had the blood of the Empire's royal family flowing in their veins. They all had the same teacher, close or distant. All of them had inherited the close combat skills of the Leaf family of Philadelphia. They were either fierce or ruthless. This kind of battle was definitely not very exciting to watch, but it was definitely the most dangerous melee battle. This kind of battle started suddenly, and often ended very quickly as well. It was even faster than the people involved could imagine. The pistol left Chi Dabing's hand, and at this time, it finally fell to the ground, making a crisp sound. Su Lo and Chi Dabing's bodies approached each other in a strange posture. Their right legs were like steel, deeply embedded into each other's center of gravity. Then, the 2 twisted their knees at almost the same time. Their feet still didn't leave the ground, but their knees fiercely hit each other. The dull sound of collision suddenly sounded, and the pants on the 2 people's knees shattered at the same time. They didn't know how many times the 2 iron knees had hit each other in a flash. Chi Dabing's face was pale. He felt the sharp pain coming from that place and knew that the knee's cartilage had been broken. His body leaned forward powerlessly. However, this accidental change that seemed like he had lost his balance and could only admit defeat gave him an opportunity to turn the situation around. He suddenly bent his right arm and used the height difference to avoid Su Li's left arm. He drew the straightest line in the air and used the tip of his elbow to fiercely smash Su Li's shoulder. Su Li's left shoulder seemed to have an extra mountain. He seemed to hear the surface of his shoulder blade crack. His waist and abdomen couldn't withstand such a huge force. His left leg suddenly went soft, and he squatted down. However, his eyes were still bright as he stared in front of him. Whoosh! Taking advantage of the squatting position, Su Lo pulled out the military knife hidden in his boot at lightning speed and fiercely stabbed it into the open and defenseless chest in front of him. With a poochie sound, the delicate and sharp military knife pierced through Chi Dabing's palm that had come to block him based on his battle instinct. It stabbed into his waist and directly cut through the muscle fibers in that area. It even pierced through the vertebrae behind his waist and directly broke his nerve bundle. Almost without any pause or hesitation, Su Lo pulled out the military knife as fast as he could and once again stabbed it diagonally into Chi Dabing's body. The military knife accurately pierced through the gap between the ribs and the soft lobes of the lungs. The sharp tip of the knife reached the edge of the heart. At this time, the intense pain from the nerve bundle was transmitted to Chi Dabing's brain. His face was extremely distorted. He instinctively wanted to scream, but it was blocked by a thick and strong palm. Don't scream. Sulu half squatted on the ground and looked at Chi Dabing, who was leaning against the wall and slowly sliding down. His left hand covered Chi Dabing's mouth so hard that his veins were exposed. With a poochie sound, Chi Dabing spat out the blood that he had been holding in his chest. He quickly took a few deep breaths, and his pale face slightly recovered. The sharp military knife in his right hand was still deeply stabbed into Chi Dabing's body. The scene looked a bit bloody and strange. Chi Dabing's face was ashen as he leaned against the wall. He looked at the military knife under his ribs with the corner of his eyes. He imagined that the sharp tip of the knife could pierce through his heart at any time. He was terrified and started to cough. Blood spurted out of his mouth from his lungs to his trachea like fireworks. He forcefully swallowed a mouthful of sweet saliva and looked at Su Lo, who was squatting in front of him. He said with a trembling voice, "You can't kill me. No one knows where she is. If you kill me, you will regret it for the rest of your life. Tell me where she is." Su Li's hand that was holding the military knife was very stable. Even if Chi Dabing coughed violently, he did not let the tip of the knife pierce through his heart. He said, "If you don't tell me, I will kill you. If I tell you, you will still kill me." Chi Dabing smiled bitterly. "For the same reason, even if I agree to your conditions, you will still kill Auntie." Sulu said, "If that's the case, I might as well kill you first and then go find her." Chi Dabing fell into a great panic. He had never thought that there would be a person in the world who would not be threatened like Sulu. He clearly cared about that fat woman so much. Why did he dare to do this? Su Li's expression suddenly became serious. He covered his ears with his left hand and said, "You found her. Inform them." Then he looked at Chi Dabing and said an address. Hearing this address, Chi Dabing's body stiffened. He knew that he could no longer use Susan to threaten this small-eyed man. He rolled his eyes in despair and suddenly said hysterically, "Teacher will not let you kill me. Don't forget that I am also teacher's student. We are from the same school." After a moment of silence, Sulu said with an expressionless face, "You are his student. I am just a worker. As for the same school, we are from your mother's school." After saying this, he pushed his right hand and the sharp military knife directly pierced through the man's heart. Chapter 878. Sulu pulled out the military knife. His face was still expressionless, but when he heard the spluttering sound, his brows slightly furrowed. Chi Dabing's throat made a gurgling sound as he gasped for breath in vain. His legs twitched, and he died. Blood gurgled out from under his ribs. Not long after, it stopped because of the loss of vitality. The red sun outside the window was already setting. Sulu stood up and looked back. He saw that around the streets of the capital, there was a stretch of plain gray buildings. As usual, it was monotonous and dull, but it was as if someone was looking at him. Then, he looked back at the closed door again. Outside the corridor, there were Chi Dabing's loyal subordinates, Tang Zhizhong's body that was gradually turning cold, and the resistance members in their respective rooms who still didn't know what had happened. Without spending too much time thinking, he grabbed the edge of the small window with his right hand and directly jumped down. Falling through the air, the light red light of twilight flashed quickly over his body. Sulu silently thought about how Chi Dabing had asked him to jump out of the window to escape. He killed him, and now he still wanted to jump out of the window to escape. The difference between the two was probably that the former was forced to leave, but now it was his own decision. Whether there was any annoying resistance or pressure had always been an important basis for him to decide the direction he wanted to go. His feet landed on the ground with a muffled thud. Sulu silently climbed over the wall. Before he turned the corner, he subconsciously looked back at the auto repair factory building. He could vaguely see many figures shuttling between the buildings in panic. If he left quietly like this, the resistance would probably think that he killed Tang Zhizhong and Qi Dabing. Moreover, there would definitely be an intense power struggle within the organization. However, this was ultimately something he didn't have the ability and qualifications to deal with. Imperial Second Royal Hospital, Back Mountain Intensive Care Unit. Su Lu hurriedly arrived by helicopter. He pushed open the blue door and quickly walked to the side of the bed. He reached out and held the hand of the woman on the bed. His mood finally calmed down. In the instant before he killed Qi Dabing, Philip searched the database of the Imperial Intelligence Agency and used 3 near-Earth military satellites to conduct a high-density scan of suspicious locations around the capital. He finally succeeded in finding the place where Aunt Susan was imprisoned, a remote ranch in the suburbs. Su Lu had Philip notify the Imperial Intelligence Agency. The agency's Special Operations Forces were already on standby. Now that they had the specific location and the enemy's layout, they parachuted into the ranch like tigers and wolves. It didn't take much time to rescue the ant, and no one died in the entire operation. It was just that Aunt Susan had caught a cold the night before and was greatly frightened today. Her body was very weak. After she was rescued, she was directly sent to this luxurious royal hospital, and she was injected with sedatives. At this time, she was in A, and she was slowly receiving a high-energy nutrient fluid. Su Lu looked at the ant's white hair that was messy on the pillow and reached out to gently tidy it for her. He noticed that the ant's brows were still tightly furrowed in her sleep. Her dry lips trembled from time to time, and she used some kind of dialect to lightly mutter words that were difficult to understand. He couldn't help but frown. At this time, the door of the ward was pushed open. A middle-aged man in a black official's uniform walked in with a cold expression. He had a luxurious staff under his arm. Behind him followed 6 or 7 stern-looking subordinates. The officials in charge of the ward's security all bowed to the side and didn't dare to stop them. It seemed that he was a big shot. Su Lu slowly stood up. Looking at the man who was getting closer and closer, he suddenly said, "I have a patient here. Whatever you want to say, go out first." Obviously, this big shot who called himself Commandery Prince Jinzhong didn't have the leisure and time to sympathize with the patient. Thinking about it from another perspective, as the Commandery Prince, who was personally appointed by His Majesty to temporarily lead the affairs of the Intelligence Bureau while Huai Chaoshe was in charge of the front-line battle, he had been blinded by the anger of being neglected. He didn't consider why there was such a sudden action today that he didn't know about. "What's your position in the Bureau? Who approved this action?" The Commandery Prince looked down at Su Lu with 1% of his eyes. He didn't do it deliberately. He naturally looked at Su Li's face and scolded in a deep voice, "I will naturally punish you after the matter. What I want to know now is, where is the base of the rebel organization? Why were you able to escape from there alone? Tell me everything you know right now." Su Lu frowned and quietly looked at this member of the imperial family. He roughly guessed that the high-ranking officials in the Intelligence Bureau had used some unknown method to hide their identities. Their intention was none other than to let the Commandery Prince meet with him. Realizing that he actually dared to frown and look at him impatiently, Commandery Prince Jinzhong snorted. His eyes were extremely round. He was probably going to kill someone in the next moment. Su Lu ignored him and directly turned to walk out of the ward. After everyone left the ward, he suddenly turned to look at the Commandery Prince and said, "I don't want to talk too much with you. I'm just doing my business. However, to avoid trouble, I can tell you that in my eyes, there has never been anything like a Commandery Prince or Prince. If you have the same idea as me and don't want to cause too much trouble, I suggest you ask the people around you or the staff in the Intelligence Bureau about the specific situation." In reality, these words were long-winded enough. However, because Sulo was unwilling to have too much contact with the imperial officials and was even more unwilling to reveal his identity and shout about the glory of his family like a noble young master in a confrontation on the street, he would rather remind the commandery prince and let him investigate on his own. Ever since he was a teenager, he had not liked to play this game of relying on his father. Back then, he had been an orphan in a mining family and did not have the right to rely on his father. Now that he had the most powerful father in the entire universe, he did not want to acknowledge him. Commandery Prince Jinjiang narrowed his eyes slightly. The expression on his face changed continuously because of this person's calmness. He stared at Su Li's face. Suddenly, he took a phone from a subordinate and asked a few questions. After hanging up the phone, the commandery prince no longer had his initial arrogance. His eyes were filled with an extremely complicated expression. He looked at Sula silently for a long time and then said, "The emperor summons you to the palace." Sula paused and then said, "Not now. I will go when I have time." Because he owed a favor to the imperial royal family for this matter, his answer at this moment was already as gentle as possible. However, when it fell into the ears of everyone in the corridor, it was still like rolling thunder. He dared to directly refuse the great emperor's summons and say that he would go when he had time. Commandery Prince Jinjiang looked at him like a monster. He had wanted to use this opportunity to scold him as an elder. Suddenly, he thought of this person's past glorious deeds. He thought of how the most hard-working prince of the empire, the most bloodthirsty commandery prince, had been unreasonably killed by this small-eyed man in front of him. He immediately gave up on his previous thoughts. At night, Aunt Susan woke up. Su Lu stayed by her side and comforted her with a few words. Looking at Aunt Susan's haggard and sunken eyes, he did not explain too much and quietly urged her to go back to sleep. After Aunt Susan relaxed and fell into a deep sleep, Sula walked out of the ward and came to the verdant garden at the edge of the building. He looked up at the strange moon in the sky and lit a cigarette. He sank into a complicated and confused mood and was silent for a long time. The royal hospital was near the mountains and rivers. The scenery was excellent, especially in this special protective area behind the mountains, where only those with noble titles could live. It was built in the valley and welcomed the rising moon and sunset through the plum trees. It was so beautiful that it was like a dream that he did not want to wake up from. He thought of everything he had experienced during the day and guessed what was happening in the car repair factory. He thought of how he was now far away from that place as if nothing had happened. He saved Aunt Susan and strolled in the beautiful plum forest. He felt that it was really like a dream. Elder Tang Zhizhong's words kept echoing in his mind. The longer they echoed, the more the scenes and suggestions were like poems in a dream. They gradually faded and faded. Although he did not forget them, they became more and more vague. Become the king of the left sky star region. Sula narrowed his eyes and looked at the bright moon hanging high in the dark blue night sky. He admitted that he was tempted at that time in the room, otherwise he would not have been silent for so long. Just like what Li Pifu said on his sickbed, Feng Yu went to Dong Lin in the past partly because he wanted to witness the tragic beauty of the decline of a society and civilization. To be able to witness some kind of big change in history was an irresistible temptation. Who did not want to go back to the beginning of time and see Schiller write wonderful works? Who did not want to go back to the beginning of history and see the Tai dynasty peacefully give up power and the scene of thousands of people celebrating at the beginning of the Republic? Becoming the emperor of the empire, witnessing a big change in the left sky star region that had not happened for tens of thousands of years, and even personally participating in it, this temptation was too great. It was so great that even he, a rock in Dong Lin, found it hard to suppress his desire. However, the sudden change in the situation and the cold situation caused by Chi Dabing made him quickly realize that the plan of the resistance organization could not change the world of the left sky star region. This kind of reform path from the top to the bottom would eventually lead to the old path of war and slaughter. No one would be willing to give up the rights and interests they already had, let alone the entire class of the imperial family. That Prince Jinzhang he saw earlier might be afraid of him because of his bloodline and did not even have the courage to oppose him inheriting the throne of the empire. However, if he carried out the agreement with Tang Zhizhong, this prince would definitely resist at all costs. Su Le could not even imagine what kind of attitude Hui Chaoshi would have when the time came. In comparison, the current imperial family of the empire tried to use education to bridge the gap between the classes, which seemed more gentle and feasible. However, how could this kind of scratching through the shoe stop the pain of hundreds of millions of years? The bright moon hung high in the sky and the plum trees were fragrant without flowers. He walked slowly in the back of the mountain of the hospital, the cigarette between his fingers gradually burning out. He thought for a long time but still could not figure out why. He could not help but laugh at himself and admit that he was indeed a little stupid in this regard. Chapter 879. Star-seizing Palace was very tall, so tall that it reached into the clouds. Su Le walked through the streets of the capital, looking at the building that overlooked the mortal world. He always unconsciously did not understand why the countless bloody rebellions of the empire had never harmed this seemingly slender and fragile symbolic building. Why had the successive emperors who lived at the very top been accompanied by the stars at night? Why had they not been able to cultivate a broad heart? More importantly, where had the empire obtained the technology from so many years ago to be able to protect that environment? Standing behind the internal official, he felt the gentle movement of the floating elevator. Because too much time had passed, he had been silently thinking about these things. Only when the elevator doors silently opened and that screen covered in golden sunflowers came into view did he suddenly wake up with a shiver. The emperor of the empire, Hui Fuchai, was sitting against the wall on the couch. He wore a fitting black and purple robe, with a belt of round stones tied tightly around his waist. Paired with the stone ring that bound his straight white hair behind his head, it gave him a particularly solemn and dignified feeling. Su Le walked up behind him and said, "Thank you for yesterday's matter." "You?" Hui Fuchai slowly turned around and looked at him coldly. "This is the education you received in the Federation?" "In my impression, the Federation has always believed that the people of the Empire are barbaric orcs, so why is it that you, who they taught, do not know how to speak respectfully to your own father?" Su Le maintained his silence. He did not explain anything, nor did he want to refute anything. "What did you say when you met with those trash yesterday?" Hui Fuchai looked at him with slight mockery. "They really want you to be emperor. And then after I die, they will throw the empire into chaos." Su Li's gaze lowered slightly. In a low voice, he said, "The current empire is already in chaos enough." Hui Fuchai's sharp brows furrowed slightly. He looked at him coldly and suddenly said, "Since you do not bend your waist for power, since you loathe the smell of the imperial palace, why did you meet with those trash? Or is it that a trash like you is also moved and wants to take over everything in my hands?" The first two sentences were from that day outside the palace walls, the contents of their conversation in the wild graveyard. Su Le slowly raised his head and calmly looked into his eyes, saying, "I have never thought of myself as trash. Cowardly and cowardly. He only has brute strength, but his shoulders can't carry anything. He can see the entire universe, but he has to deal with those rat-like trash. He looks at his father's back like a thief. If this kind of person isn't trash, then who is?" Hui Fuchai unceremoniously reprimanded him, "I really don't know what you've learned from Nasri. You didn't even learn his arrogance. True arrogance lies in the lack of fear, nothing else. Su Lo was silent for a moment before replying, if saying bad words in front of you is courage, then I've already said enough dirty words when you whipped me with the thorns in your hand. As if recalling the extremely unpleasant scene of the past, Wai Fu Chai slowly furrowed his brows. He recalled that it was he who had whipped this little guy in front of him until he was covered in blood and ordered him to be killed, but he had no idea that this was the only bloodline he had left in this universe. With this thought, Wai Fu Chai's anger grew. Perhaps even he himself could not tell where this anger came from. From being deceived. Coming from a loss of face. In short, he slowly straightened his body. With the cold demeanor of a sovereign, he narrowed his eyes at Su Lo and said, "You are already old. You are already old, I don't want to educate you anymore, and I don't want to talk about responsibility with a piece of trash like you. But you must remember, the blood of Bai Yan's Hui family flows in your body, you are my son, you are my subject, you must maintain the respect that you deserve. In the category of thinking that I can accept, there is no such thing as a ruler and subject, a father and son." Su Lo looked at him and said, "So please don't try to use this to intimidate me. Since you are not willing to kill me, then don't use this tone of voice to speak to me." Ever since he had ascended to the Star-Seizing Hall, no one had dared to use this tone of voice to speak to the Emperor of the Empire, not even his most trusted and favorite Huai Chaoshi. Wai Fu Chai's eyes narrowed even more sharply as he gloomily stared at Su Li's face. Suddenly, he raised his right hand and slowly stroked his white hair. His expression changed from the calm before the storm to its usual indifference. With undisguised mockery, he said, "Yes, an idiot like you will only fall for Pobre's tricks." Su Lo slowly clenched his fists, not to attack, but to control his emotions. He simply did not want to meet this man in front of him. Although in terms of blood, he was his father, the reason he did not want to do so was not because of fear or anything else, but simply because he did not want to. Wai Fu Chai calmly looked at his tightly pursed lips. For some reason, his emotions once again relaxed. After a pause, he said indifferently, "This time I helped you, but you killed that traitor Chi Dabin, so we are even." Hearing these words, Su Lo was somewhat puzzled. He was well aware of the extent of the Empire's infiltration of the so-called rebel organizations. The harvest that year was the most bloody proof, so he did not believe that the rebel organizations under the leadership of Chi Dabin could pose any threat to the imperial family. Do not underestimate any enemy, even if it is an enemy that has already died in front of you. Wai Fu Chai waved his hand slightly. His black and purple sleeves fluttered behind his back. He expressionlessly walked to the railing and said in a low voice, "That bastard is lucky to have the blood of our imperial family in him, and he has the necessary personality to succeed. In my opinion, if he had not met you, he would have had a very good future." Su Lo silently followed him to the railing. Thinking of Chi Dabing's declaration in the room that was like grinding steel, thinking of those stormy statements about the theory of evolution, he could not help but frown slightly. He thought that if that person was given a chance, perhaps he really could have grown into a character like Pobre. But people with ability often think too highly of themselves, and people who think too highly of themselves die easily because they always feel that they are fated and will not die so easily. Wai Fu Chai slowly walked to the railing and extended his left hand to caress the intricate patterns on the railing. He looked at the white clouds drifting outside the building and said with a calm expression, "However, I am the only one truly fated in the entire universe. Since childhood, countless people have tried to kill me, but I am still alive. As a monarch, I have to have unworldly self-confidence, so I have never worried that the battleships of the Federation will be able to destroy this star-seizing hole. The stars in the universe move and the clouds move, but this palace always exists. I can't even see any possibility of it dying." Wai Fu Chai looked at the white clouds flowing outside the railing, at the place where the bloodstained thorn fell, at the clouds where his elder brother had fallen. After a long silence, he continued, "If you think about it carefully, I do not have many regrets in this life, other than Lipifu dying too early. That day, when I heard that he had died, I suddenly realized that I could not find an opponent. Do you understand that kind of loneliness?" Sulu looked at the somewhat melancholy back of this monarch and couldn't help but think of some of the special literary descriptions in Schiller's novels, but he couldn't laugh no matter what. The same words, when spoken by different people, had completely different effects. If it was a hedonistic son sighing about his loneliness, it would only make others feel annoyed and disgusted, but the man who said this was the master of the left sky star region, the man with the most authority in this part of the universe, so it was only right and proper. Huai Fu Chai's face carried a faint hint of self-mockery as he sighed emotionally. "In the eyes of many people, and in your eyes, this battle before you is hair-raising, but in my eyes, it is nothing more than a game. These little fellows are messing around. Do I have to participate? After father and master passed away, I waited here for Lipifu for 20 years, but in the end, he hid by that lake and refused to come out. Since he is dead, where can I find an opponent?" Su Li's brows rose slightly. "But many people have already died. People will die. Lipifu will die, I will die, you will also die. The fate of people is death, and the reason people live is because they want to live to the fullest." Huai Fu Chai turned to look at him. "I am an emperor, I do not have the right to the fullest. Since you want to go to the fullest, I will not stop you. But you must remember, no matter where you go, no matter what you do, my blood flows in your body. Your glory and fall will be draped in the name of the Huai family. Even if you are going to die, you must find a way to die that will not disgrace me." On the way out of the royal palace, Sula silently thought about the seemingly meaningless conversation in Jiaxing Hall. He didn't feel much emotion or sympathy for the monarch who had guarded the royal palace alone for decades. He only thought about how this monarch clearly had a vision, willpower, and determination that ordinary people could not reach. He might even have great power that was no less than Lipifu's, but because of that obsession that crossed his heart and made him unable to be happy, he waited his entire life only to see Lipifu die of old age. Just how much meaning did such a life have? And what was the meaning of his own life? Muan was waiting for him outside the palace gates. He looked with some surprise at this underworld boss who was still wearing black fur. He narrowed his eyes and asked, "I heard that you are now a special official of the Bureau of Intelligence." "My rank is very low. Although I have the protection of Her Highness, you also know that the various departments are filled with nobles and even members of the royal family. It is not easy for a commoner like me to rise up the ranks." As if he didn't see the emotions in Su Li's eyes, Muan smiled and walked side by side with him under the shade of a tree. He said, "Looks like you don't plan to stay in the royal palace." "Yes. I'm not used to many of the details of life here." Sulu turned his head and glanced at the official who was still respectfully kneeling on the ground outside the palace gates. He said, "For example, this kind of scene." He and Muan had a friendship forged through a hail of bullets. Although they had gone through life and death together on the valley road to the south of Tianjin and had worked together to bury the bodies of many soldiers from the resistance organization, given his temperament, he was still unable to let go of Muan's betrayal. However, he had now become someone who had no right to speak of his position. Naturally, he had no right to criticize others. Or rather, it could be said that he had lost some sort of confidence. Muan keenly sensed his true emotions and said with a slight self-deprecating smile, "I am not the emperor's son." Saying such words in the empire was, without a doubt, a heinous crime. The person who said it could wash their neck clean and summon all the women and children in their family to wash their necks together. However, Muan said it so indifferently. Sulu also understood. He paused in his steps, shook his head, and patted his shoulder with a smile. Chapter 880. This had nothing to do with the theory of bloodlines, but it was related to the innate inequality of human society. Su Lu recalled what Hui Chaoshi said back then and couldn't help but laugh at himself. Humans hated betrayal because it brought about extreme insecurity. It was always the hardest to defend against a sneak attack from one's companions. Therefore, no matter whether it was the Federation or the Empire, the punishment for traitors was always the heaviest in all the moral codes. For example, Mu'en right now, but it did not include himself. The noble blood of the Bai Jin Hui family flowed in his body. When he turned from a hero of the Federation to a crown prince of the Empire, even many people in the Federation did not think that it was a betrayal. They only thought that it was a melodramatic arrangement of fate. However, in the Empire, there was absolutely no one who dared to mention or even think about how many young people of the Empire he had killed on the battlefield and even assassinated members of the royal family. If he was just an ordinary person, he would have been killed by countless cold words and blades when he had cold-bloodedly betrayed the Empire and then shamelessly betrayed the Federation. Understanding this, one could understand Mu'en's helpless choice a little more. Under a big banyan tree by the road, when the two were about to say goodbye, Mu'en asked, "What do you plan to do in the future?" "A few days ago, I told someone that I don't have any choice right now. I can only hope that the two sides can stop fighting. This really has nothing to do with morality, justice, or humanity. To use a perhaps inappropriate analogy, this war to me is like a father and mother picking up a kitchen knife and hacking each other at home. What can I do as a son?" "You're right. This is a natural choice." Mu'en patted his shoulder sympathetically. After thinking for a moment, he said directly, "I may be going back to the organization soon. At that time, I may need to use your name." "You're going back?" Su Lu frowned and asked, "Now, including the Federation, everyone knows that you're a traitor. How are you going to go back? Tang Zhizhong and Qi Dabing are already dead. You should be able to guess that the people in the organization will attribute their deaths to you. My mission back in the organization is to use the evidence provided by the Intelligence Bureau to expose Qi Dabing's true colors. Who will believe the evidence you provide? When it comes to things like evidence, you can believe it when you need it. For an organization that has fallen apart and is being cursed by countless people who originally supported them, the most important thing now is to survive. As long as the evidence can give them an excuse to change and survive, they will believe it. Can you make it clearer? Under the direct command of His Highness, I will lead the entire resistance organization and carry out extensive cooperation with the royal family to establish a united front to resist the invasion of the Federation." Mu'en said calmly, "I believe that most of the comrades in the organization will agree with this approach." Su Lu shook his head and said, "There are two people that the resistance group hates the most. One is the dead Keaton, and the other is Hui Chaoshi, who leads the intelligence agency. They will never agree to cooperate with her. I'm not talking about the princess." Mu'en smiled and said, "I'm talking about you, the crown prince." Holding the fruit knife with steady fingers, he cut the thin skin. Since he could repair the delicate structure with his naked eyes and hands, it was very easy for him to cut the apple. Almost in the blink of an eye, 7 rings of thin skin were gently peeled off. He held the white apple like a lantern and brought it to Aunt Susan's mouth. Aunt Susan looked at him with a smile and shook her head to show that she didn't want to eat it. Her expression was still haggard. She looked at him quietly and asked, "Little guy, who are you?" Hearing this question, Su Lu knew how to answer. Whether it was when he was escaping in the small courtyard or when he came back this time, Aunt Susan could sense his difficulties and rarely asked him about these things. In fact, he could have directly stated his identity and believed that Aunt Susan wouldn't treat him differently because of this. But when he thought of her current physical condition, he didn't want to shock her too much. Thinking of what the doctor said earlier, his mood was a bit gloomy. The results of the comprehensive medical examination were not very good. The delicate noble lady of the past had become an auntie in the market with her arms akimbo. Behind the dramatic life were too many hardships of life, especially the hardships in the early years, which had caused great damage to Aunt Susan's body. Now, with the addition of the cold and fear, all of it broke out. Although it wasn't life-threatening, she needed a long time to recuperate. I work in the intelligence agency. Well, I should be considered a not small official. Sulu smiled and replied, those criminals who kidnapped you mainly wanted to take revenge on me. It's my fault for involving you. You have already apologized many times. Aunt Susan looked at the black hair under his brown hair, coughed twice and said with concern, is the palace no longer investigating you? You have to continue to dye your hair. Otherwise, it will be terrible if people see it. I'm not a fugitive. What are you afraid of? Sulu rubbed his hair and explained, dyeing my hair is mainly for convenience. Aunt Susan sighed and said, little guy is always lying. This is the second royal hospital. If you are just an ordinary official, how can I live here? You know. Sulu replied in embarrassment. Don't forget, I was also a lady of a noble family when I was young. Although I was not qualified to see a doctor in the royal hospital, I came with my parents to visit a great noble. Even now, I haven't forgotten the beautiful plum forest in the back mountain. Aunt Susan looked at him and smiled. Sweet memories of her teenage years flashed across her chubby round face. I said that I have a good relationship with the princess, Sulu said with a smile. Aunt Susan's expression suddenly dimmed. She gently grabbed his hand and said, there is still no news from Paul. Can you help me ask? Sulu was slightly stunned. He remembered what he heard that day and nodded. Although not all the senior officials of the empire knew who Sulu was, they soon had an answer close to the truth in the name of the intelligence department, but the answer was not a good one. The reason why Paul's allowance had not been transferred to Aunt Susan's account was indeed because there was no electronic signature of him. The reason why Paul did not sign was not because he had no time to care about this matter when he was patrolling the front line with His Highness, but because he was missing on the front line. Sulu frowned as he looked at the latest missing person list sent by the military. Looking at the eye-catching name at the bottom of the page, the smiling face of the Empire youth in the small courtyard that year appeared in his mind. He had served in the federal military for many years. He knew very well that the so-called missing person list often meant the list of the dead. However, because the bodies of the soldiers were not found, or under the heavy firepower of the enemy, they were directly turned into fragments nestled together with the mountains and rivers. For the sake of Auntie Susan's health, he was not going to tell her the news. However, Auntie Susan's observation skills, which she had developed over the years in the slums, played a role at this time. She looked at the worry in Su Li's eyes and spent the middle of the night forcing the truth out of him. When Aunt Susan was a young girl, her family was destroyed. When she was a little older, her brother joined the West Woods Expeditionary Army. He wanted to earn military merits to restore the glory of his family, but unexpectedly, her brother never came back. It was not until decades later that she got the bad news that he was buried in a foreign land and a broken diary. After getting married, she could have lived a simple life, but her husband who loved her was taken away by illness. Her life always fell into despair when she saw the most hope. Life was unfair to her, but she was strong. She stubbornly survived with her young son in the most dilapidated slums of the empire until she heard the news that her son was missing on the front line. The endless pain and darkness instantly crushed Aunt Susan's spirit. Her body, which was already extremely weak, rapidly lost weight. In just 2 days, her cheeks were deeply sunken. She could only lie on the bed helplessly and sadly, staring blankly at the sky outside the window that was filled with the scent of plum trees. Sulu silently accompanied her, watching Aunt Susan move step by step toward death. He gently held her face, feeling the touch that was much thinner than before, and said with a smile, "It's good to lose weight. When Paul comes back and sees a more beautiful mother, he will be very happy." Aunt Susan moved her lips with great difficulty, looked at him with a smile, and said in a hoarse voice, "These days, it's been hard on you. You don't have to make me happy again. I'm not making you happy." Sulu stood by the bed, looked at her face, and said calmly, "You have to live, because I will go to the front line to find him. I promise you, as long as he is still alive, whether he is captured by the federal forces, abandoned in the valley, or lost in hell, I will bring him back alive and bring him to you." The words were very calm, but there was a kind of firmness that made people have no choice but to believe it. It was like a stone silently smashed into an annoying wet mud. There was no earth-shattering sound, but it smashed a deep hole that was difficult to erase. Some kind of brilliance slowly appeared in Aunt Susan's eyes, the brilliance of life. She gently held Suli's finger with a trembling hand and said, "I promise you, I will not die, but you have to promise me one thing." "I will bring him back, don't worry," Sulu replied. "No, I want you, promise me, you can't have anything happen to you." In the early morning, in the suburbs of Jingdo where the morning light had just woken up, Sulu, carrying a backpack, walked silently in the fields with Zhong Huiyan, who he had picked up from the great master Fan Manor. "Brother, are we really going to Mo Planet?" "Yes. I remember that day in front of Auntie's grave, you said that you wouldn't go to that place until you could solve a certain problem." "Yes, I miss the Federation very much, but I can't go back. I can't even see those people from the Federation, because I still can't find a way to solve that problem." "Have you found it now?" "Maybe soon. But still not." "Yes, but I found a reason to go to Mo Planet." "What reason?" "I like Paul. He is kind and cheerful. Of course, he also has a belly full of untimely hot-bloodedness. He is a very good young man of the Empire, just like those very good young men of the Federation. I like Aunt Susan. She is a good person. Good people should live a long life, just like those kind-hearted aunties of the Federation. There is no reason for such a person to die because of war." You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.